You are right now watching the very beginning of the California Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance Enforcement Training for public agencies. This is being put on by Stop Waste, and here we are on the last day of April. We hope to be finished by 1 p.m. This is a long training. We recognize that. It was challenging for us to get all of the material into 4 hours. We will be, well, I'll tell you more about that, but we will be also taking a break partway through. My name is Jennifer West. I'll be giving a short introduction. And first, I just want to introduce you to Stop Waste. We are a public agency in Alameda County. We serve all of the cities here, 14 cities and the county itself. And as our name implies, we were created to really reduce waste in terms of landfill waste, so improving on recycling, improving compost and mulch and the reuse of materials. We work also, as you see today, on water efficiency, and we also work on energy efficiency programs. Alameda County is in the San Francisco Bay Area in the East Bay. It is home to Oakland and Berkeley, Hayward, Fremont, Livermore, and a few other places. And we really designed this training for our member agencies here in Alameda County and have supported them on WELO and many other things over the years. We widened it today to include a number of you from around the state. And so just a caveat that there may be a few slides that are kind of Alameda County focused, but we're really glad to have others able to participate today. Stop Waste created bay-friendly landscaping, a rating system, which is now handled by Rescape, which is a statewide nonprofit. We do provide technical assistance to our member agencies around bay-friendly and around Rescape rated and with WELO as well. We, for example, provide scholarships for member agency staff to attend Rescape trainings, which can be covered maintenance, design of water efficient landscapes and rating system. Every year we produce a sustainability report that shows the acres of landscapes that are now Rescape rated, reduced water use, and the use of compost and mulch. And as I mentioned earlier, we are supporting on WELO compliance as well. There are 4 of us who will be speaking today, and I wanted to introduce each of us briefly. I'm going to start with Teresa Eade, who has been working on Bay Friendly since the beginning at Stop Waste. And she has been working on the Landscape Services and Partnership Project and founded Bay Friendly, now known as Rescape. She's supported this work for many years. And I really want to actually thank Teresa especially for creating this WELO training for you today. Kelly Schoonmaker is a landscape architect. She manages our agency compost and mulch, and also manages our property and our conservation easement. And she works on carbon farm planning, implementation, and materials. And Kelly is reminding me that we said we would do a short bit of video so you'd at least see that we are live humans here putting on the webinar. Shasta Phillips did WELO enforcement at the Marin Municipal Water District and now is a Stop Waste employee. He works on enforcing our mandatory recycling ordinance in our county. And I'm Jennifer West. I originally worked with Stop Waste as a board member. I was on the city council in Emeryville and mayor in Emeryville. And now I manage the Landscape Services and Partnership Project. I'm also working on a heat pump water heater market development project. And I work on BayREN, which is our regional energy network here in the Bay Area. So energy efficiency work. I want to introduce one other person who has joined us today. Julie Sarr-Edmonds of the Department of Water Resources from the state is here on the webinar, and I want to thank her for inviting many of you from around the state to join us this morning. And Julie, if you If you want to say a word or two, I think Kelly can unmute you and you could say hello.
Julie has to unmute herself. I can ask her, but she has to make the decision. Hi, Julie.
Okay, if that's not working, we will come back. And Julie, if you are able to unmute yourself or say something a little bit later, that would be fine too.
Just write it up on the Q&A and we'll let you speak.
There you go. All right. Moving to my next slide here. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have an evaluation that we'll send at the end. We'd love your feedback if you can take just a couple minutes to provide that. During the presentation, I mentioned the question and answer box, and you can put them in anytime. We will have a break around 11 a.m. It'll be about 10 minutes, and we'll tell you exactly when to be back so that you can not miss anything. You all actually, as Kelly mentioned at the beginning, you're all automatically muted to maintain the sound quality during the webinar. And we will have some interaction, so you need to be on your toes and respond to the polls. You'll have a minute or two to do that when the time comes. All the exercises we'll mention are in those downloadable materials. We have 4 learning objectives this morning. The first one is just to understand WELO and how to enforce it. The second one is to know how to use our WELO toolkit that we've developed as a checklist for folks who are enforcing WELO. Third, we want to be sure you're familiar with the reporting requirements to the State Department of Water Resources each year. And finally, we'd like you to be able to understand how a Rescape rated landscape is one way to comply with WELO implementation. The first learning objective, I'm just going to break out a little bit more because that's obviously kind of the main event here. In order to understand WELO, we will cover the main sections of the ordinances, what triggers compliance, the core WELO submittals you'll need and at which time of the project development, the water budget, and compost and mulch requirements. When you registered, we asked you a couple questions, and indeed we saw in your responses that a lot of this is what you're looking for. So we hope we're able to meet your needs today.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but Julie is back. She is on the phone.
Great.
And it looks like she is unmuted.
Great. Julie, you want to say hello this morning?
Huh. Okay. All right, Julie, we're still not hearing you. Is your phone muted maybe? Like it doesn't look like you're muted on our end, but yeah, if your phone's muted, we won't be able to tell.
You know what? I'm going to keep going because we're about to have a poll and we'll have 1 minute to troubleshoot that if we need to.
I think she should speak and interrupt whenever she can, and
Yeah,
we'll just keep
absolutely.
going till then.
Jump right in, Julie, if you can. And if we don't respond, it's because we can't hear you. Our agenda today is to have an overview from Teresa, and Teresa will also cover the WELO applicability process and submittals. Then we'll switch to Kelly, who's going to talk about plan check. We'll have a break around 11 a.m. It's a little bit flexible depending on where we are in our slides. And then Shasta and Kelly will wrap up our plan check section. And then we just have a couple slides at the very end as our final. You know, we created this webinar as an in-person training, and we quickly pivoted a month ago to bring it online. So bear with us. We do have some amazing exercises that we were going to do in person that we can share with you at the end if you're interested, but we're not going to have that portion for the online webinar. So we're going to present to you all of the material that we have, but no, there's a little bit more that we could provide if you're interested. Our next question is our first poll. And the question is, who are you? Who is on this webinar, and what is your role in your agency vis-a-vis WELO? So Kelly is going to put that poll out, and I would love for you all to respond.
Okay, here we go.
Thanks.
You can scroll as well.
Yeah, you might need to scroll down to answer the second question. Oh, it's fun to see the answers come pouring in.
Jennifer, did you mention that we're recording this webinar? I think you did, right?
I did, but it's good
Okay.
to remind people.
Yeah, and so yes, and it will likely be available. It depends. I mean, if something terrible happens, we won't make it available. But I mean, if we'll check the quality, and yes, we will be making this available later.
Great. And someone else is offering a suggestion in terms of Julie on her phone needing to be on her computer, maybe to speak.
Mm.
So if that doesn't work. All right, it looks like most of you have responded. And Kelly, when you're ready.
Sorry, I've got a Julie thing going on. Hold on.
That's okay. You have another 10 seconds to respond.
Nope.
Oh, there we go.
It's
Great.
all done.
We had 163 folks vote. That's amazing. What I see is 70% of you are planners, and that's not surprising to us, but good to know. A mere 7%, 12 of you are landscape architects. We have some building inspectors, that's about 13. We have engineers, 23 or so, 14%, and landscape managers, 8%. And then in terms of what department you work in, it looks again like most of you, over half work in planning. The second largest group is in community development, 25%. And then we have it kind of even with building, engineering, public works, and water conservation. And a few of you work in parks or other. So wonderful. It's good to see who's on, and with such a wide distribution geographically, it's really interesting to see actually how consolidated your titles and your departments are. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Teresa Eid, who will be covering the overview.
So I'm going to talk about the overview. What is WELO, why it matters, the ordinance sections. We're going to walk through our toolkit and reporting to DWR, and we're going to get more specific as we go through. So let's start with the overview. So what is the intent of WELO? It's obviously to reduce outdoor water use and waste. It establishes statewide requirements and affects new and renovated landscapes. It's a model ordinance. The Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. It was created by DWR, and it's now required by Cal Green Code as well. It was first started as a model ordinance in 1993, nearly 27 years ago, and it was updated in 2010, and then again during the middle of the drought through the governor's executive order in 2015. But that was considered a little too erratic, and so now it's on a regular 3-year cycle that's integrated with the Cal Green Code update cycles, so that the next time it could possibly be updated is in 2023. So the trend in all these updates is that it allows less water use and affects more projects. So we really are looking at reducing water use or conserving as much water as possible. So essentially what it is, it's a water budget and a list of required practices. And so that's, I think, a good conceptual approach to thinking about it. The state is saying that the days of unlimited water use on built landscapes are over. Instead, low water use should be the driving force of the design of our landscapes. And working with landscape contractors, architects, designers, starting 20 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for people to have no idea how many gallons of water the landscape they were designing would need every year. And the state's saying, no, we're going to give you the gallons of water and you have to at least meet that requirement. So that's the big picture, but it does get tricky in the details. So that's why we created these tools and have this training. So why does WELO matter? We have this in the class materials when you are able to download it. And it's a flyer, and we encourage every city to have their own WELO webpage for project developers. And there's plenty of good information on here that you can pull off and put on your webpage. Basically, California is a Mediterranean climate. Water is a scarce resource, and it's made worse by a growing population and climate change impacts, which are already making our water supply less reliable. So just as a reminder, this is 2014 in Northern California. The Oroville Dam got extremely low. In 2015, this is the U.S. Drought Monitor map for California. And you can see that over half the state is extreme drought or exceptional drought. And then this is a looking back 16 years, and you can see that our snowpack has been below average for most of the years. And in our current year, 2020, we're at 53% of normal. So that's exciting. And then this was in the San Francisco Chronicle just within the last 10 days. It's a chart over the last 1,200 years showing the trend of mega droughts. It was recently published, and it measures soil moisture by looking at tree rings. And the authors say that the start of the 21st century in the west of the US is consistent with how these ancient mega droughts began. So we need to be as up on the use of our water as we possibly can. So one of the things I wanted to also say is that this is a pie chart. It's looking at how we use water in an urban setting in the state of California. And I want to point out that 49%, or nearly half, of it is for outdoor water use application. And this is potable water supply. And so what we want to do, this represents a great opportunity for conservation. I do want to say that in the cities and urban and suburban places, we need our landscapes. They help contribute to climate resiliency and quality of life, but we need to build landscapes that are adapted to California's summer dry climate. Okay, so this is going to be a poll, and I'm going to ask for Kelly to help out here. So true or false, cities have been sued for not enforcing WELO. And so if you could go ahead and launch that poll, it's just a quick one. Just click true or false, what you think is true. And let's see what the results are.
Okay, the results are rolling on in. Okay, we'll give another 10 seconds.
And we'll share the results.
Okay, here we go.
So most of you are aware, 80%, it's true. So let's, it takes a moment here for my screen to wake up after a poll. Okay, so true. The Natural Resource Defense Council is a nonprofit. It has sued several agencies directly for failure to enforce WELO in their permit process. And recently, it has filed a class action suit on hundreds of cities and counties for failing to report to DWR on WELO implementation. So currently, the Department of Water Resources does not impose penalties for not enforcing WELO. So it appears that this nonprofit has stepped into that enforcement vacuum. But later, Kelly will tell you more about a new law, SB 1383. It's focused on reducing short-lived climate pollutants, but it does have enforcement mechanisms, and it requires annual reporting on WELO to CalRecycle starting in 2022. So pressure is mounting on reporting and implementation of WELO. So Stop Waste is not a water agency, but we are investing in WELO implementation because of the importance of compost and recycled mulch requirements in the ordinance. It's also the reason why Calorie Cycle is interested in WELO implementation. So urban soils are often very degraded, and during construction, sites can be graded down to the subsoil. So compost and mulch helps jumpstart that natural cycle in the soil by returning carbon in the form of organic matter. So you get billions of beneficial microbes added to the soil, and those were propagated through the compost process. And some of the benefits are it increases water infiltration into the soil. It creates more larger pore spaces and soil aggregates that allow air and water to circulate. It increases soil water holding capacity by 30%. It helps the organic matter in the compost, helps make the soil act like a sponge. It naturally improves plant health through increasing soil food web health. It breaks down pollutants in the soil. It reduces stormwater by 70 to 80%. So it does that by the first two items, by increasing infiltration and water holding capacity. And the pollutants are broken down by the biological activity of those beneficial microbes. And then it also, we have found out in recent years, it provides long-term sequestration of carbon in the soil. They have found out on rangelands, just a 1/4 inch application can have a 30-year benefit, drawing down carbon as much as a ton per acre per year for 30 years. So it is part of the climate resiliency and carbon sequestration. Okay, so we've gone through why it matters. Now I'm going to talk to you about the ordinance itself. It's defined in the California Code of Regulations, Title 23, Chapter 2.7. And if you were able to download it, you could have that open now. There are 6 sections, 490 to 495. And the first section is purpose. It's on the first page, page 37 of the model ordinance from the state. And it tells you why we're doing the ordinance. The definitions, this is on the next page. This is pretty meaty. There are 83 terms defined. It goes on for 4 pages, and then somebody enforcing WELO, that can be a bit intimidating. The more you use it, the more you get used to the definitions. But we've created a little cheat sheet, and this is the WELO key terms that are really that you use for budgeting. So if you want to know what the plant factors are, we have it here. If you the ETAF, you need to know for budgeting. The irrigation efficiency, also part of the budgeting equation. So these numbers are at your fingertips. Here is the formulas for the water budget. So for anything to do with the water budget, these 9 terms are key, and we've pulled that out in our class materials, and we recommend just having that available at your desk. And also it's helpful when Kelly does her part of the presentation. So what I want to do just for a moment here, if I can, is to escape the PowerPoint and navigate. So when and if you get to the class materials, you'll download a zip folder, and there will be these folders with, these are all our toolkits. Right now I'm going to go to DWR materials, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the model ordinance. And this is a bit basic, but I wanted to show it to you because we all know about Control F for find features in PDFs, I imagine. But like even a term as simple as mulch, we have an affinity for mulch because we're a waste agency. You can type it in and it will scroll to all the times it's mentioned in the ordinance. And this is useful if you have a key term that you haven't run into. It's an easy way to see not only the definition, but mulch is used throughout this ordinance. Here it's saying, you know, in a fire zone, what type of mulch is to use, how to use it in soil preparation in different situations. You want to use recycled and mulch post-consumer. And then it even talks about in mulch planting areas, you have to use low volume irrigation, not overhead spray. So just by typing in the word mulch, you can see it throughout the whole ordinance, and that can be useful. And any key term can be just typed in and you can quickly access it. So that's an advantage of the electronic version. If your city has adopted its own WELO, it's also very good to have a hard copy of that handy. But for key terms and things, this is a very useful tool. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out of that.
Teresa, just so you know, your screen is only sharing the PowerPoint.
Oh, nobody saw that, huh?
No, it's okay though. It's okay. I don't think you have to redo it. But if you're going to do, I can't remember if you have more times where you leave the PowerPoint, but if you
No,
do.
that's it.
Okay.
So
all right.
it worked the last time. Sorry about that, folks.
Yeah, it just depends how you've opted to share your screen.
Oh, okay. See, there you go. Sorry about that. So you can look, use the search function. Sorry about that. So we are back, and most of what you're going to need as a reviewer is in section 492. And it's here on page 38.3 at the bottom. And so we'll talk, you're going to become very familiar with this section. Section 493 on existing landscapes as a reviewer doesn't really impact you as too much. 494 effective precipitation. It's allowed for you to have to allow for precipitation in the water budgeting process, and so that section defines that formula. You don't have to use it. 495 is reporting to DWR annually, and I will go through that. So just for 492, there are 18 elements in 492. 8 are the most relevant ones, and that we'll be going over in this training. So the landscape documentation package, the water budgeting, soil management report, all these things we'll go over, and you'll become very familiar with them. So that's the 6 sections of the ordinance. And now we're going to talk about the appendices. And remember, this is just the overview, so don't worry too much. So we're from Alameda County. These are not all of our cities in the county, but you look up the city that's closest to you. In Berkeley, it would go with Oakland's. And what this is the evapotranspiration table. It's the reference one for you to use in your water budget. And the one thing Kelly will go over this, but the one thing I want you to know from this training is this is a fixed number for your city. And it's in these tables. You look up the county you're in, you find your city or a nearby city that represents your climate zone. And then that should be the number that's always used in your water budgeting. So it would be good to memorize and know what the reference ET is for your city. You can always look it up. And this is useful for water budgeting. Appendix B, this is the worksheet to figure out the water budget. Appendix C, it's a certificate of completion. It's due post-construction. And so here's a sample. And then Appendix D, it's the very last page of the ordinance. And this is a description. It's for smaller projects, 2,500 square feet down to 500 square feet. So it's less, takes less effort or less submittals to be approved for smaller projects. All right, so let me tell you now, I've just gone over what's in the ordinance as an overview. Don't worry if you didn't get everything, we're gonna go into more detail. Now I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the Stop Waste WELO Toolkit. And I was gonna navigate off of this page, but I won't now. So the Stop Waste WELO Toolkit, we have these elements. We have a brochure you can use on your counter. We have a water budget calculator. It's an Excel file, and we have these checklists. One of the things is we have these WELO resources. So these resources are in the class materials, and they're on this website, stopwaste.org/WELO. And if you navigate to our checklist, then everything that we mention in here all the links, they're all in this WELO resources, and the frequently asked questions, we have a section on that. So I'm just going to go ahead and talk to you more about the toolkit here. So the first thing is we have this brochure. It's available in a PDF, and it's also available in a hard copy, only for Alameda County cities. We've made a small print run for Alameda County cities. So if you want a hard copy to hand to people or to put on your permit counter, you can. We recommend that folks put this on your WELO website. It's available as a PDF. It's in your class material folder and on our website. And you can click and download this all in one file. I wanted to just, this is a 3-panel brochure. It talks about thresholds, what's due at what stage of construction. So during the permit process and then after permitting, and then it gives the option for small projects what's due. And then I also want to talk to you a little bit about this is our water budget calculator. It's an Excel file. You fill it in. The reference ET I spoke about would be filled in here. The nice thing is that you could put this on your web page, and you could ask for all your submittals to include a water budget done on this Excel file calculator. And that way, though, you know, the math would be correct. A number of things that people can easily get wrong would be correct. You can, if you don't use it in that way, you can do it to use, when you're reviewing water budgets, you could enter in the different zones and check the math that way. So there's a couple of ways that you can use the water budget. And then I just wanted to tell you about our checklists. We have 5 of them, and I've gotten feedback from city staff that that's intimidating. But really what you want to do is the first 2 are required. The landscape documentation package review. Every project needs to submit the information on that, and the certificate of completion. There is one caveat I'll tell you about on those. But so the certificate of completion is done at post-construction. One of the ways I want to tell you how it works is that the project developer would submit the checklist, and they have a way to fill in on the applicant side. And this will ensure that you're getting all the elements. You'll get a more full submittal, and it'll be easier to find what you need because the applicant is being prompted. And then you have an option on the side as a reviewer to pass, fail, or to make notes. So it's designed to facilitate communication. And we have it in 2 formats. We have it in a fillable PDF, or we have it in Word document. So if you want to customize this checklist to your city or county, you can do that. So the certificate of completion, as I mentioned, it's due post-construction. It has the same project information as the landscape documentation. The irrigation audit checklist, we don't expect city staff or even the project developer to fill this out. They are required to do an irrigation audit by a certified auditor. And so this is something that you could have on your website, give to the project team and ask the auditor to fill it out when they conduct the audit and submit it back to you during with the certificate of completion. They do have to submit some kind of proof and audit of the irrigation system. So they could use this checklist. Landscape inspection. So WELO does require that city staff go out and inspect the landscape post-construction. This is a checklist you can use to do that. And then there's prescriptive compliance. This is only for small landscapes, 500 to 2,500 square feet. It would be used instead of this one. So those are our 5 checklists, and they're available online. And they should be good for statewide use. Oops, sorry about that. So now I'm switching gears from what WELO is and tools to reporting to DWR. So most of you know this, local governments need to report in January 31st on the previous year. And It's only been a requirement since 2015, and it's the main method the state has to gauge compliance with the ordinance. There are about 20 questions. There are a few questions on how your agency adopted the model ordinance. Then there are data questions, and these questions require you to track information you would not otherwise track. And that's what gets to be a little tricky. So you do have to set up a tracking system, and what you want to track is the total number and type of permitted projects that triggered WELO compliance. Single family home, the number of commercial, the number of renovated landscape, and the total landscape area that was WELO permitted. And in addition to that, they want to have some overall information that you may already be tracking on permitting, general permitting in the jurisdiction. So the total number of permitted projects, the total number of new housing starts, of new commercial projects, of landscape retrofits. And then they want you to describe, there's a few questions on describing the actions to verify WELO compliance. So one of the things that we've done is in the landscape documentation package checklist, on page 2, these are all the WELO specific questions that you need to track. So if you're using our checklist, it helps create a system for tracking. And it depends how you, it would vary in your, depending on the jurisdictions. I think one of the most streamlined ways of doing this is that many cities already have permit tracking software. And the idea is that you would add fields for WELO in your permit tracking software, and you would add these kinds of fields in there. And so then you would also want to program the permit tracking software to create a WELO report. So this would work in Munis or Acela or any of these others type of municipal permit tracking softwares. So it does take somebody with forethought building in this system. If you don't have that software in your city, then you need to like just maybe make a copy of this page for every project and put it into a folder, enter it into an Excel file, and then you summarize it annually when you report to DWR. So that is one suggestion for how to do it. So if you have questions about it, seems like most of us on this call are familiar. This is the DWR webpage. You can get there through this link, or you can search in an engine that says DWR WELO. And I have trouble navigating just from DWR directly to this page. So I always include WELO when I search for it. And one of the things is that the 2019 form that you need to fill in is right there at the top of the page. If you have any back years you haven't yet filled in, there are forms to do that. And also, if you want to look at who's submitted or what's been submitted in the past, all the reports are right there. And if you, let's say we clicked on 2018, you would get more or less alphabetically, but not completely, the cities. And in Alameda County, we have Hayward and Fremont. And we're going to open up the Fremont one and take a look at that. And so you can see 2018's report for Fremont. And you can see that Janet Hiddle did it, and it has her contact information. And I happen to know that Fremont, Janet has left the city of Fremont. So the new staff person coming on could go back and easily access all that information from past reporting. A council member who's just heard about WELO or has a question could go and look at past reports. So it makes it transparent. And as we know, NRDC can also go and look at these reports. But I think they're very useful in terms of a staff person. You can look at other cities and see and learn from them. And also it creates a historical record for you. So in the fall, there was a presentation done by DWR. And this is the percentage in November, or maybe it was late October, of how many reports that DWR had received. So it's well under 50%. It was like just below 35%. It went down to below 30 in 2017. NRDC started kicking in and it's popped up to 45%. I'm sure it's higher than this because I don't have information beyond November. But I did compile that information for Alameda County. And we've been doing better than average, about 78% overall. Excuse me. And we have 10 cities who have completed the report every year. We have 2 cities who've never done it, 1 city that did it once. But I did go through and I compiled the reports and found that we had a collection of 370 acres of landscape area and 873 WELO projects in total that have been WELO permitted. And that represents millions of gallons of water that have been saved and hundreds of tons of compost and recycled mulch that have been applied. And it helps build resiliency in Alameda County for climate change. So I have here 2019, I took a quick look. Last month we had 1 city, we have 8 cities now. And I was just wondering how many of you know if your jurisdiction has done your 2019 report. So Kelly, if you could go ahead and launch that quick poll. We can see how many of you know if you've filed that or not. And if you haven't, you can always look it up and find out.
Okay, everyone should see the poll. And I heard that at least one person didn't. So if you can't see the poll, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm just curious to see how many people we're actually getting that can or cannot see the poll. So it's a couple people. Interesting, because it should just appear on your screen. So it's unfortunately nothing I can deal with on this end. Okay, we have about 70% in, so here we go, and we will go ahead and share the results.
So yes, 60% have their jurisdiction has filed a 2019 report. 11% or 17 say no, and 30% don't know. Well, you could look it up right now and find out, or right after this presentation. So, okay, so that wraps up, always takes a moment of, that's right. Here we go. So that wraps up the overview. So everybody take a little breath, and we're gonna go ahead and move on to applicability, process, and submittal. So now we have an overview of the ordinance. You have an idea of what the toolkit is that we have, and whether you're in Alameda County or not, we welcome, it's for public use, and you know about reporting to DWR. So now we're going to talk about what projects trigger WELO, enforcement options for the smaller projects, what projects are exempt from WELO, and introduce some WELO submittal requirements. And then we're going to go into plan check, where the real meat is, and that's where Kelly will present. Okay, so what triggers WELO? It's pretty simple. First step is determine if there is a landscape in the submittal or not. Next, determine if it's new construction or if it's renovation. Then determine the landscape area of the project. So for new construction, the trigger is low, only 500 square feet. And if for renovated landscapes, it's a little higher at 2,500 square feet. So if you forget what these thresholds are, it's in our brochure right there. You can hand it out to people, or you can always search applicability in your electronic copy of the ordinance, and you'll get to those thresholds right there. I have city staff people who tell me that they only do reviews intermittently, and so they forget some of this key information. But just knowing where you can find it helps. So the tricky part is not so much the thresholds, but it's how your agency or city or county handles landscapes. Some don't require a permit if it doesn't have a building project. So it's also if the project triggers building or landscape permits, plan check, or design review. So you need to clarify in your own city to all the staff in your department how, what triggers a building permit for landscape and WELO enforcement in your jurisdiction. So that's the little bit of the tricky part, but the thresholds are pretty clear. All right, I'm going to talk about enforcement options for small projects. That's 500 to 2,500 square feet, as I mentioned it. It's in Appendix D here on the very last page, and all this small text here is defining it. And you don't have to memorize these requirements because this is where our easy checklist comes in. One of the things is there is no water budget submittal, so there's no hard math for small projects, and it not just the math, but there are fewer submittals, so there's less need for professional help for small projects. It does require, instead of a water budget, that for residential projects, 75% of planting areas are low water use plants. And for non-residential, it's 100% planting area are low water using plants. So that means no turf in non-residential if they're going to do this small projects. But there's a caveat: planting areas with edible plantings can be high water use, and irrigated projects irrigated with recycled water, they're not limited on, you don't have to pay any attention to the water use if the whole site is being irrigated with recycled water. So there's a shorter list of irrigation system requirements. And then these elements are the same. The project information listed here, the compost and mulch requirements we're going to tell you about, and turf restrictions we're also going to tell you about also apply here. So really, if you use the checklist, it's pretty easy. And we'll go into greater detail and plan check about what you need to review on general, but not on prescriptive path. So it should be self-evident in the checklist. Now I have one more poll to keep you guys awake. Does the project type need to comply with WELO? So we're assuming that the size threshold is met. Generally, you can always look it up in the model ordinance under applicability, but I want to test the group's knowledge. So go ahead, Kelly, if you'll launch a poll with Zoom. So,
oh, sorry, just for those of you who may not be able to see it, someone did suggest that you might have your pop-ups blocked, although I have mine blocked and I don't have a problem with it, but it might be something to try. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So there are 7 questions here. You're going to need to scroll. We're going to allow you a little bit more time, but let me go ahead and fill this out for these different types if you believe that the projects need to comply with WELO. Yes, no, or it depends. So go ahead and fill that out as much as you can.
And we'll give you a little bit longer for this because there are quite a few questions and you'll want to scroll through to get to all of them. So we'll give you, how about another minute or so? Not or so, less than a minute, maybe another minute.
Yeah, I think less than a minute, if we can. So how's it looking? Are we about there?
They're still rolling in. Another
Okay,
5 or 10 seconds.
Oh, good. We already got the results here. So it looks very good, folks. I'm working with a knowledgeable crowd. So everybody got the first one correct. It's yes. Single family homes, I think that's been a challenge for folks. It is important to remember that these projects are allowed a higher water budget if it's residential. So existing plant collections, we're a little divided on that. And that is, no, they don't have to comply with WELO if they're open to the public. So no, so things like arboretum, botanical gardens, if they're open to the public, they don't have to comply with WELO. A registered historic site, again, people were a bit split on this one. So no, it does not have to comply with WELO if it's registered with locally, with the state or with the federal government. If that landscape is part of a historic registered site, it does not have to comply with WELO. A caveat is if it's part of a historic district, then that's not enough. The site itself has to be registered. City parks, let's see, I need to scroll down to see what you guys say. Okay, everybody got that one. That is a big one, yes. City parks do have to comply, but there's lots of areas that can be considered special landscape areas that allow large areas of recreational turf. You'll learn more about that. We do have city parks sometimes having trouble complying with the low volume irrigation requirements we've experienced in our own cities. So, oops, I jumped ahead. No irrigation, what did you? Yes and no. So this is a confusing one. We've had a couple of cities give us a call because they had residential projects with no irrigation where the project developer was claiming that it doesn't require WELO. But yes, it does, unless it's one of these two things. Specifically in WELO, it says if it's a habitat restoration project or if it's a mining land reclamation and there's no permanent irrigation, then it does not. But all other no irrigation does have to apply. So I think that Appendix D might be a good approach to look at that. The elements there for having low water plants would be, I mean, they all have to be low water using plants to comply. Okay, state projects. Yes, they do have to comply, but they're not enforced on the local level. So you don't have to deal with it. And it's slightly different. Schools, again, let's see what you guys said. Oops, let's go back. Sorry about that, folks. So depends. Yeah, most people said yes. If it's a private school and you're reviewing it, then yes. But if it's a public school, yes, it does. It's a different set of rules and you local entities are not enforcing it. Okay. Let's move on. So who enforces WELO? I think you guys are on this call because you know it's mainly the cities and counties. They have the responsibility for the vast majority, but they're not the only ones. The Division of State Architect for public schools and universities, and they have different WELO requirements. Water agencies are also involved. So if a new project requires a new water meter or a service upgrade to a site, that will trigger enforcement by water agencies, even if the city's already approved it. So there may be an opportunity for you cities to work with your local water agencies. You should give them a call, find out who's doing those reviews, and try to coordinate with your cities. So this is really important, and I just like to sort of state it out loud. Like most everything, it's really helpful to have a clear process and well-defined roles, and everyone in the agency should know who is doing what. WELO just won't happen by itself or assigning it to one person. So key practice is that everyone in your permitting and planning department knows that landscapes trigger a WELO assessment and likely a WELO review. And secondly, everyone knows that the WELO review process, what it is in your agency. So that should be a baseline for your agency. Then you want to have some WELO experts do the review within your agency, ideally. And it should not just be one person, 2 or 3 people at a minimum, depending on the size of the city. Ideally in-house. If you have staff with landscape architect degrees, they have an easier time and have a higher comfort level interpreting WELO. If you can borrow them, even just to set up the WELO review process, if you have them in your city, it's helpful, it's not essential. You can also contract out this service. So that is something you can consider, especially for larger projects. So the other thing is to have somebody who's the DWR reporter on WELO that's designated. That can be one person. They need to be empowered to set up systems to track the data. And so that will be involving people in the permit process, that everybody knows that this data needs to be tracked and that they do the annual report. And then you know when to coordinate with water agencies. So if you go through the materials and flag that there's a new meter or a service upgrade, then you would reach out to your water agency. So those are some roles for clarification. It may take a few meetings and then occasionally, you know, as an agenda item in staff meetings to go forward. But it just will be much easier if you create a system instead of it having being an adjunct. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk about when do you have to consider WELO. So these are generally 3 main stages of a project development when it comes to a city or county. It's the pre-submittal, conditions of approval, the permitting stage, and post-construction. So really, the state has no requirements for WELO in pre-submittal or conditions of approval. The bulk of the WELO requirements occur in permitting, and then there are some key requirements post-construction. So let's talk about those. So pre-submittal through conditions of approval, even though there are no state requirements, this is a great opportunity to introduce WELO to the project team. And if you have a website, you can direct them to your website. You can explain this project is likely to trigger WELO, so we want to get a commitment from you that you will meet it. And here is what we expect. Here are the documents that you have to provide and when you have to provide them. So if you can make that clear, that's a really important thing to do in this stage. Also, you can consider a fee to cover costs of WELO review by staff or contractor. We have a city in our county that for larger projects, they hire a contractor and they collect a deposit for WELO review at this stage. All right. This is what's submitted during permitting and design phase. We're going to go through this in great detail. You have 6 elements. It's project information, the water worksheet or budget, soil management report, the landscape plan, irrigation plan, and the grading plan. And only the soil management report, if there's mass grading, then that could be submitted post-construction. So post-construction, it's the certificate of completion. Again, project information, there's a certificate of installation, that's new. Record drawings are only required if the project has changed from the approved plans. The soil management report is only required if it wasn't submitted during the design phase. Verification of the soil report was implemented needs to be submitted. The irrigation audit report, irrigation scheduling and a hydrozone map, maintenance schedule for the landscape and irrigation system. And if you're in Alameda County, our cities have adopted the landscape waste diversion, construction and demolition diversion ordinance. So this is a good time to collect that information for Alameda County projects. Okay, so I've just introduced you to the process, and now we're ready for Kelly to go ahead and talk to you about plan check.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about here, we'll just kind of go through a process to do plan review to kind of simplify it and hit the big, we won't go through every single measure in the ordinance. That would take forever and probably not be that useful to you either. So the plan is to do more of a like high level overview and give you a strategy, and then make sure you understand the big pieces. Okay, so let's get going. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the first thing you want to do when you get a set is make sure you have everything that you need. So the WELO requires 6 pieces of documentation, 3 plans, and 3 additional pieces of information, including the project information, what it's about, water budget calculations that Teresa mentioned, and also a soil management report. Since this question came up earlier in the Q&A, I will go ahead and address it now. Regarding the soil management report, you may get that during the planning phase, but in many situations, you can't do the soil report because you don't have the rights, you don't have the soil that you're actually going to be planting into. So for example, if you're doing an infill project, then you would have to wait to do the soil report right before construction. So you may not get it at that time, but what you would want to do, of course, is ask why they are not submitting it, just so you know that the ordinance does allow for flexibility there. Okay, so that is everything that you are, the submittals that are required to be there. And then, but it's not necessarily everything you need. Some things are required by the ordinance, but they might not be captured in one of those submittals. So the other things you might need are construction details, a plant list, which isn't technically required, but which seems sort of like something obviously you would need to verify this. And you might find some of this information in specifications, and especially for irrigation information, which Shasta will talk about, product information can be helpful to you in verifying. So let's say you have everything, great. The next thing you do, and this kind of also came up in the Q&A, is look for these required statements. The ordinance requires that on the landscape plan, irrigation plan, and grading plan, there is a statement that says that the submitter is aware of that has complied with the criteria of the ordinance. And why I think it's a good idea to look for this first is it's easy to find. It might be on the cover sheet too, and it's up to you if you want to accept that. If I feel like if a landscape architect has prepared all those plans, you might as well have them sign it once. They don't need to sign it all the time, but it's definitely up to the reviewer. But it's a good indicator so that you know that if they have this random statement, it's not random, it's required. If they have this required statement on the plans that you wouldn't normally have, at least they're aware of the ordinance and hopefully they are compliant with it. So, okay, that's there. So you say, okay, we've probably got a pretty good submittal here. Still, let's start looking at the plans. So, as Teresa mentioned, this, the WELO is built around a water budget. The maximum applied water allowance is your budget. You could think of this as like your annual budget, like how much money you make in a year. Like you want to have that number be more than the amount of money you spend in a year, right? So it's just like any budget. Okay. So here's how it is calculated, or we will go over the calculation, but I want to talk about the factors that influence the water budget right now. And I will use water budget and MAWA interchangeably, just saying it. So it depends on where you are. And so if you're in the desert or you're in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, you're going to have different reference evapotranspiration. And so what that means is evapotranspiration is all the water that's lost through evaporation and transpiration, right, in a given place. So that is going to be higher in the desert, right, because it's hotter and drier than it is in a cold, foggy place, right? And so the way they measure this, every place, as Teresa mentioned, again, in Appendix A, you can see lists of all the reference evapotranspiration rates or reference ETs. And the way they measure it is it's a field of well-watered turf mowed to a height of 4 to 6 inches, and it's really well-watered. And they measure how much water is evaporating and transpiring from that field. Okay, so it's a really high number, but this is like your 100% number, okay? And this number is actually, reference ET is measured in inches per year. The other thing that they take into account is the size of the landscape, right? The small residence on the top is obviously going to use less water and need less water than the giant estate on the bottom. So landscape area. And then lastly, DWR has set limits, right? So of the amount of water you can use. So based on these two things, they have an ET adjustment factor they set. And that what that means, it's a percentage of the reference ET times landscape area, right? The reference ET for your site, the amount of water you would use. If it was a well-watered field of turf, you can use a percentage of what you would use for that type of planting, right? And so it has two different values. Whoops. For residents, you can use 55% of that reference ET. And for non-residential projects, like the one on the bottom, you can use 45%. Okay. And in addition to that limit, DWR understands that some types of landscape areas are valuable and they might need to use more water. So they've built in some flexibility. And so those areas are edible planting areas. And by this, we mean areas dedicated solely to edible plants. And so just like strike just for an example, this isn't like one plant of decorative kale in the middle of, you know, a bunch of like high water using plants, and they're not able to just call that edible planting area. And it is in both non-residential, as you see on the top, and residential situations. Also recreation areas. And as you can see, both of these examples are non-residential. And this is because recreation areas only exist in non-residential. So what that means is if someone has a lawn at their house and they say, well, it's a recreation area, or, you know, it's a special landscape area because it's for recreation, they can't do that because the recreational area isn't a thing that exists in residential projects, if that makes sense. And so in addition to kind of active rec, like these examples, it also would include things like passive recreation, like picnic areas and that kind of thing. So that's where you might get you might have to use your judgment a little bit. But if you have, you know, a picnic area associated with a restaurant and it's actively, and it is used, you know, it's up to you if you want to count that. But anyway. And then lastly, recycled water. And this doesn't mean gray water. This means the real, like this means a full system infrastructure of purple pipe. And all these areas get to use 100% of the ET in this area. So as opposed to the 45% or 55% of the rest of the landscape area. So when you're checking the water budget, the definitions again are very helpful. They start on page 38, and they are, like if you ever have any questions of like what constitutes the landscape area, a refresher of what the ET adjustment factor or ETAF is, that's that 45% or 55%, or what constitutes a special landscape area, you can find that in the definitions. And Teresa already went over Appendix A, and yeah, as you can see, your city might not be here, so you might have to approximate. And if you have, and some places they might be measuring ET, and so you may have some documented source where you can say what your ET is and provide that to submitters, and that takes out a lot of the guesswork. So I do know some contractors who say, well, I know what that ET is there, and I know better. And I said, oh, do you have a measuring device? They said, oh, no, I just know. And so it can get you out of some of those conversations if you tell them what you want them to use, and also it levels the playing field. Okay, so that's where you find ET. Okay, so we're still not going to get to the actual calculation yet because there's a few things you can check without using math. So the first question is, of course, pretty obviously, is there a water budget? And so you're going to have to look for that. Here is Appendix B, which is what Teresa showed. This is DWR's template for a water budget, and it's great that they provided this. I would say one of the limitations with this is there isn't a place to show your work for calculating the MAWA. which means that you kind of have to do arithmetic for them if you get this submittal. And it's also a Word document, so it's not doing the calculations for you as a submitter. And so sometimes it'll be separate, and it could look like this. It might be, this is an Excel version that was created locally. Sometimes it may be on the cover sheet, like this one right here. And then, as Teresa mentioned, we have also created a calculator in Excel that you can use, either provide to submitters, and when you get a water budget that's created in a different format, it makes it easy to check the calculations. And we'll go ahead and walk through that, and maybe even, yes, and we'll go ahead and walk through that in a couple of slides. So, but anyway, even if you don't have that, you can, there's a lot of things you can check without having math. So if everyone, let's see, wants to open up this file right here, which is exercise 1, the water budget. And if people are having trouble finding it, here. Here's your class materials distribution that you downloaded. Or wait, here are the materials that you downloaded. I'll just walk through this. If you go to exercises, 2 exercises, open that. What you want to open here is exercise 1, water budget worksheet. And it should look like that, and everyone should have this open. Go ahead and minimize this again, get this out of the way. And so these are the things you're going to be checking. Is the ET correct for this location? You can see the locations right here, the top. Is the ETAF correct for this type of project? And you can see that this is a home, so does it have the correct ETAF? And special landscape area, you'll notice they have a special landscape area. Is it really a special landscape area? And then just so you know, we did fill in a MAWA calculation for you right here. So why don't I give you all, we'll give you, I don't know, 2 minutes? Seem reasonable to go ahead and walk through that, and then we'll go over the answers.
Kelly, are you going to pull up the exercise on your screen as well, just so people know what to look at?
Do you not see it right here?
I see your PowerPoint.
That's the exercise right there.
Okay. I thought you might open up the...
I did open. Okay, that's a good question. Well, people can be working on this and we can figure this
just
out.
so it's a
I
little
had
closer.
opened it. What do you see right now? Tell
Yeah,
me.
can you make it a little bigger on your screen?
Well, people should have it.
They should. I'm just
but
making sure they know.
I want to
exactly
make sure they can see the whole
like.
thing.
Yeah.
I don't think I can. It's being persnickety. It wants to. Oh, it just took a second and then it kind of came to life.
Oh yeah, and it has
But,
all the word.
That's right, because
paragraphing.
I like to know that I have 2 spaces after
Great.
the end of the sentence, because that's how I do things. Okay.
Thank you. That's great.
All right. Okay. How's that? That seem like enough time for people? Can we,
Yeah, that's good.
could you raise your hand if you're done? How's that? That might help.
Oh, we're getting a whole bunch of people saying they're done.
Looks good. Okay, let's be done with that then. Gonna close that. All right. Okay, so back to this. So let's see, was the ET correct for the location? Let's see, well, the location is Livermore and the ET listed was 44.2. Wow, okay. And then, is that what, and so, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer in front of me. So that's where we would look for that. And here's, okay, so here's all the areas that we would be looking for the information. Oh, I thought I had the answers on this. I'm sorry. So is the ET correct for this? And if we look here, why don't I turn on my video so this is a little more useful. Okay, so what we do is we look in the Appendix A, and we would find, if we could open it, and we had it in this version of the WELO. Sorry, I am woefully unprepared for this part.
It's 47.2 for Livermore.
Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, so yeah, I guess I had the wrong copy of the WELO out. Sorry, everyone. All right, so that one I needed. So look in the appendix A. This could happen to you. So have it handy. Have your right appendix there. So that is incorrect. And then is the ETAF correct for this project? Well, if we look down here at the MAWA calculation, we will notice that it's right here. This is the 0.55 right here. That'll become easier for you to check once you learn the calculation, but it's still something you can check before knowing the actual calculation. And then lastly, the SLA, does it meet the definition? And as we discussed, residential areas or residential projects don't have recreation areas, so this lawn would not qualify. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so I had some settings change. Well, okay. So now we'll talk about the estimated total water use. And this would be the same as if the MAWA is your budget, then these are your expenses, right? So this is how much water you're going to use. And you want to make sure that that this number is less than your MAWA. Okay, so again, we calculate it based on evapotranspiration and landscape area. And then in this case, instead of the ETAF that's defined by DWR as your maximum percent of the reference ET that you can use, this is where you get to, well, if you're a submitter, this is where you get to be creative, right? And try to design within those parameters. So it's based on plant factor, how much water your plants need, and irrigation efficiency, which is what it says, the type of irrigation you're using. Okay, so a little bit more about those. For the plant factor, there is some flexibility in here, and there's also a lot of guidance. So DWR prefers the water use classification of landscape species be used to determine how much water a plant can use. I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like. Maybe. There we go. And so can you all see this WCALS database? Can some other panelists tell me if they can see this?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay. So this is the WCALS. You can look up you can look up many plants here. And I say many, not all, because there's so many thousands of plants in California that it's not a fully comprehensive database. So in some cases you might have to use, a submitter might have to use a different source. Okay. And then you'll notice then we're going to have to turn this into math. So the way the WCALS defines what a plant, how much water a plant uses is qualitative. It's in a range of very low to high, okay? And then within there, and within each of those qualitative measurements, there's a range, right? So 0.1 to 0.3, et cetera. And the reason that there's a range, and it's not just one number, is because if you're planting something in a sunny spot or a windy spot or a hill, or it's on a slope, it's going to use more water than if it's in a protected, shadier spot, right? So you need to have a little flexibility there. So that is that's up to the designer of the project, what they're going to estimate that at. And let's see, and then the other thing that you need to look at is irrigation efficiency. And this is a little bit easier to review, I think, because the values are set in in the WELO by DWR for the water budget. Now, and these values are for drip irrigation, 0.81, and for overhead irrigation, 0.75, so spray. Now, people will come to you and they will say, well, I know that I'm going to do subsurface irrigation and I know that my efficiency is 0.99. And when that happens, that's fine. That could very well be true. However, this is another way that DWR has leveled the playing field by making these values required to be used in the water budget. So for the purpose of water budgeting, drip irrigation 0.81, overhead 0.75. And then another note about low volume drip bubblers irrigation. that is required everywhere in all mulched planting areas, except for turf, and then a situation where you'd have like a creeping rooting ground cover or some direct seeding application where it would be sort of contraindicated. Okay, so when you're calculating the ETWU, what you do is, let's see, you start from the ground up. So the landscape should be divided into hydrozones. And what a hydrozone is an area of an area that contains a group of plants that have similar water needs based on the factors that we talked about before, like sun, shade, the plants themselves, slope, irrigation type. It could be irrigation frequency or scheduling. And some of you may be familiar with irrigation zones, and it is a similar concept, but a hydrozone could be a group of irrigation valve zones that are all irrigated, or that all have the same water needs for the purposes of water budgeting. So if that makes sense. So for example, this plan on the right, you can see it has 4 different hydrozones, different sizes, different plant factors. So what you would do to get the estimated total water use is figure out the water use required by each hydrozone and add it up. It's pretty easy. So here we go. Again, no math. And here's our same exercise 1, if you want to get that out. This time, I'm just going to walk you through it instead of letting you look at it on your own. So your first question is the MAWA greater than the ETWU? And you can look over here and you will see you'll see the totals here, and you can compare them pretty easily. So yes, good for them. Okay, so then you think, okay, well, what's next? Well, let me make sure they've done everything right, made all the right assumptions. So is the irrigation efficiency correct? So you can see that listed here. And as we just discussed, DWR is pretty explicit about what you need to use for these calculations. And so these are not correct. Okay. And then is the irrigation method correct? So we were talking about you use a low volume irrigation in all mulched planting areas. Well, here's your irrigation method. And for the shrubs, they both have drip. And the trees are spray. You're like, and it's they probably need to be on something else, but we don't know. So what we need to do is confirm this by looking at the plans. And then lastly, you want to see, is the plant factor correct? And this is actually sort of a trick question. You can't, it is located on the sheet, but you can't tell without the plans. So at this point, you need to get the plans and the plant list out and do a little spot checking, which we'll talk about. So, okay, here's the math. And so it's all stuff you've already seen. So here's how it works. It's based on where you are, right? The ETO. And then I mentioned that the ET is measured in inches per year. Well, the water budget is measured in gallons per year. So this 0.62 just gets you from inches to gallons. And then we talked about the type of project, residential versus non-residential, and the percentage of the ET or the ETAF that they're allowed to use. That's right here. It's 55 or 45, right? And then the size of the project, the landscape area. And this is the total landscape area. So this would include any of the special landscape area as well. And so then, so for example, if your project was 1,000 square feet, and 500 square feet of that was a vegetable garden, this number here would still be 1,000 square feet, including that 500 square foot vegetable garden. And so what you would do is you add, so when you're calculating the special landscape area, so you calculate, you include it in the total landscape area, as you see here, and then you add in the extra water that the special landscape area is allowed to use. So to do that, to get it to 100% of ET, you subtract the ETAF from 1, if that makes sense. It'll probably make more sense when you see it with numbers and start to calculate it, but that's basically the concept. Okay, and so for the ETWU, very similar, right? We've got where you are, and then instead of the ET adjustment factor that is set by DWR, here we've got plant factor and irrigation efficiency, right? So plant factor divided by irrigation efficiency, okay? And then times the landscape area, and in this case, it's the hydrozone, the specific hydrozone you're working on, because your plant factor and irrigation efficiency is going to be different for each hydrozone. Okay. All right, so we're going to go through a little example here so you can see it with numbers. That always helps me a little bit. So here we go. So we've got, let me back up. We've got really the simplest landscape project right here, this giant green square. And the ET in this location is 41.8. This is going to be a non-residential project. And the total landscape area is 1,000 square feet. So here's how we calculate it. So 41.8, the ET times your conversion factor times 0.45, right? Because non-residential, times 1,000 per square feet. And you get 11,662 gallons per year. Great. So let's see what happens when we add a special landscape area. So for this, you do the same calculation to a point, right? So you do the ET times 0.45 times 1,000 for the total landscape area. And let's add back in the extra water that the special landscape area is allowed to use. And that, so we do that this way. So 1 minus 0.45 times 250, which is the size of the special landscape area, right? And then the new MAWA would be 15,226 gallons per year, which is a pretty significant difference. So you can see why checking to make sure a special landscape area really is a special landscape area will help you meet your conservation goals, right? Because people can otherwise be inflating their water budget to allow themselves to use more water than they should. Okay, so let's try using the stop waste calculator. And I might just walk through this with you guys. So hopefully, let's see. Sorry, I'm gonna have to do a little shifting around. Apologies. Whoops. I went back to get a link and now I'm regretting it. Oh, that wasn't too bad. Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. So if you open the, if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and open this water budget, water use calculator, which is in your course materials. And I'll show you where that is. Save. Okay, I'll show you where that is. There we go. It's in the Stop Waste Toolkit, and it's easy to find. It's the only Excel file that is in here. So here we go. Okay. All right, so I will skip over this. When you open the file, it might say you need to enable editing, so go ahead and check that. When you all open the file, because I've opened this a bunch of times, it probably will prompt you to enable macros, and you'll definitely want to do that. But in case you forget all the steps, they are here, as well as a link to the Appendix A, or where to find Appendix A anyway, for if you wanted to get your reference ETs. Okay, so we're using, if you can all still see my screen, here's our little project over here. Hopefully it's big enough to see. And okay, whatever. And so here we go. So this is, again, it's a non-residential project. So we fill that in. The reference ET is 41.8. And just to back up, you can see that when I filled in non-residential, the ETAF pre-populated itself. It automatically went to 0.45. And the total landscape area, including the special landscape area, is 1,000 square feet. Okay, so then we have the 11,662, which we saw before. So knowing that we have a special landscape area and it's going to affect our MAWA, I'm going to go ahead and jump down here to add it now. So we have a multi-use lawn and it's 250 square feet. So we add that, and here we get our new MAWA. Now what we could do is populate the hydrozone areas, shrubs, and for shrubs we will go ahead and we'll select an irrigation type, and they're on drip. And again, you can see this automatically inserts the 0.81, and this is 500 square feet, and the plant factor is 0.3. Great. And then we have some ground cover. And this is going to be irrigated. It's a creeping or rooting ground cover, and so it's irrigated with spray. It's fine. And it's 250 square feet. And its plant factor, it's a moderate water use plant, 0.6. Okay, So what we find out is going back up here, we'll see our estimated total water use. And based on the hydrozones, the special landscape area, the plant factors and everything, we find that our ETWU is actually exceeding our MAWA. And you get a little notification here that it has not, that it's exceeding the MAWA. So that is how that works. And so just to review, one thing we find useful, and the reason we created that was to help people review quickly. So you can see it didn't take too long to do that. Obviously, if there are more hydrozones in a more complicated project, it would take a while to review. But if you want to require people to use that Excel file, it's available to you now. But if you've received the water budget and it is not using, they haven't used this particular file, you can see it's pretty easy to check what you need. And another thing you could do with that is if you wanted to preset your ET, you could go ahead and do that and lock that cell so you don't leave that up to anyone's judgment either. Okay, so in addition to the water budget, you're also going to need a planting plan or your hydrozone plan to look at all these things. As we discussed, some things you can't check with just the water budget. You're also going to need the irrigation plan. Shasta's going to show you how to review that. And so let's see, the next thing you can do is plants. And I know, especially from some of my planner friends, that this is where they really start to flip out. And I want to tell you, you do not have to flip out. Plants are not the first thing you should look at. You can see there's a lot of other mistakes they could make well before you get to plants, right? But anyway, at some point you're going to have to check plants, but it doesn't mean you have to know them all because there's way too many to know anyway. But here's what you need to do it. You're going to need the water budget, obviously, because you want to see what they're calculating. You will need a planting plan, and you'll need a hydrozone plan to see how they've organized their plants. You might need a layout or a site plan. Sometimes the information you might need is there. You will need a plant list, and you'll probably need WCALs, which is easy because it's on the internet. Okay, so let's see. The way, if I see a plan, and my experience in this is based on reviewing projects in an office, not reviewing projects at a planning counter, but talking to a lot of people who do review projects at a planning counter. So just so you know, that's where this is coming from. I would be looking at, well, I want to make sure it's in compliance. So the first thing I want to look for are high water users. So turf, right? Because I know if I see a lot of those, then it might not be in compliance. So I would look for just the high water using, high water hydrozones to start off. And then just the rule of thumb is that 45% ETAF for non-residential projects. It's almost impossible to have a high water use hydrozone in that situation. And in a residential situation, well, I'll talk about in a second. However, you might see turf in a non-residential situation because it could be a recreation area, right? And you might see other types of SLAs like the edibles that would be a special landscape area. But in the regular landscape areas, it's almost impossible to use any high water users. Okay. And then residential, you might see about 25% that could be high water or turf. And then I think I've beat this horse into the ground, but turf can't be counted as a recreation area in a residential project. So this is what I would do. After I looked at the plan and got a sense that, okay, it looks like at least there's like, they have hydrozones, they're mostly low, a couple medium, and maybe a high one if it's a residential project, or no high ones if it's a non-residential project. I'd take a look at the plant list and see. And plant lists come in many shapes and sizes, which I'll show you. But you want to see mostly low water use plants, some moderate, and a few high, very few high, right? And you can see in this sample plant list that they do have the water use listed over here. Actually, here, let me get my. Yeah, so you can see over here that the water use is listed. And then compare that to the hydrozones. What you want to make sure, like if you see any high water using plants, there shouldn't be that many, but those might be the easy ones to go find. And if you can find them, make sure they're not included in a hydrozone with low water using plants, because that is not allowed. The way that hydrozones need to be organized is plants of all the same water use, right? And while the ordinance does allow for low and very low plants to be mixed, low and moderate to be mixed, moderate high to be mixed, you can't like skip one of those water use categories. You can't say high and low or moderate and very low, okay? So, so you want to make sure that you've got a combination of both. And then the next step would be to spot check, right? Water use with WCALs. If you found something that was very low, and you were like, really, that's very low, it would be easy, because that's going to really help them meet their water budget, right? If they're saying, I wouldn't spot check high plants, because it doesn't matter, they're only hurting themselves. But if you want to make sure people are complying with the ordinance and you don't have a lot of time, I would start with the very low plants and then the low plants to just kind of spot check and see that they're assigning them the same value that the WCALs has assigned them. Okay. And then, so for example, oh, for Pete's sake, this laser pointer seemed like such a good idea at the time. Okay, here we go. So back to our friend, the WCALs, I'll just kind of show you how I might do that. Is going to the plant search database. And let's say we're in Alameda. And I would look for Douglas fir. They've recorded Douglas fir as low. And I'm like, really? I don't know about that. So I would then search for that. You can search by botanical name or common name. And oh my gosh, they were right. Who knew? So, so that's kind of what I'm talking about with spot checking, is if you have sort of a few plants that you might want to just make sure that they are what they say they are, and instead of checking every plant. Okay, so as I mentioned, plant lists can look like a lot of different things. Here's some examples. This is the one I just showed you. And so another piece of the toolkit that we have is the Stop Waste plant list template that you can provide to submitters to just kind of make sure you're getting the information you need to review. So this includes both kinds of names, botanical and common name, a place for plant factor, a reference so you know where they got their plant factors, and the size and maturity. I'll talk about why that's important, and invasive and why that's important. If you are in Alameda County, spacing plants to accommodate them at their mature size is a requirement from the Bay Friendly Basics, as is not planting any known invasive plants. And that list defers to the California Invasive Plant Council and their short list of invasive plants that you can see right here. And so this may or may not be the case. I know we have a lot of people up and down the state, and I don't know what all the different invasive plant regulations are or plant spacing regulations are, but if you have any of those additional types of regulations, you could also include them in your in any templates that you have to make sure that people are complying with things like invasive plants and proper plant spacing. Okay, so water features. People often ask about water features. These are not plants, but they do need to be included in the estimated total water use, and they're typically on a site plan. And as I mentioned, you need to include them in the water budget, and they need to be included according to the ordinance as a high water user. And there are other requirements that they have to. For example, they have to use recirculated water. So here's what you need to to look at water features, and this includes pools, which we'll talk about in a second. But they have to use, so they have to use recirculated water. So you probably are not going to find that on a plan, right? So you might see that here in your details, like you can see what kind of what's going on here under, in section, and then or in the specifications. If they, you might have to look for that to make sure that they're using recirculated water. Okay, so pools. Here's two pools in two different situations. One is a common area of a multifamily development on the left, and the other is a backyard and single family. And the ordinance is kind of silent on pools as recreation areas. Now we know that pools can't be a recreation area in single family because that concept doesn't exist, but in multifamily it's a little different. Like, this is a common area. What if it were a community center or a public pool or a university that had a pool? It seems like in those situations that the pool could be considered an SLA. However, it is not explicit in the ordinance. But if it's not an SLA, that would be a high water user. However, and it would be in the high water use zone in residential. One of the questions, I'll just address it right now. One of the questions that came in about how do you handle a pool only situation? Well, so for pool only situations, especially at the single family home, if they're part of the new landscape construction, then then that threshold for reviewing them would be 500 square feet. But most of them are typically part of a landscape renovation, which means that threshold for review is at 2,500 square feet. And that's a really big pool. So if it meets, so I've from up and down the state, seen and heard stories of different ways that people have gamed the system to try to get their pool in there. And I don't see, when people want a pool, people want a pool. And so I just don't know that there's any way to get around that. What you could do, because you, in adopting your ordinance, is require the use of a pool cover. And that should help a lot. Right now, they're recommended by the ordinance, but at the city level, you do have the ability to make a more stringent ordinance. And so that's something I would recommend. Otherwise, if it's part of a landscape design, that is, like, if it was this whole one like on this photo, that's probably, if that's it, that's probably not gonna meet a water budget. So anyway, I don't have a great answer. I'm happy to talk more about it after this, but that is it for me. And I think we're taking a break, right, Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I have a few questions I want to pose because it's about 6 minutes to 11 now. And there have been great questions coming in. I want to thank Julie and Teresa for responding to those questions. Okay. But there are a couple that I want to pose, and Kelly or Teresa could respond to some of these in a few minutes here. The first is just about applicability for WELO. A couple questions here. One is that non-irrigated landscaping question again. Someone posted that in previous direction, or from previous trainings, it seemed that WELO didn't apply to non-irrigated landscaping, but we're saying today that it does apply even if you're not putting in irrigation. Just confirming.
Say that again.
WELO applies even if you're not irrigating the landscaping.
That's such a good question. If it's new, okay, so there's the exceptions that we have, right? I mean, that are, you know, like restoration that is a temporary irrigation project or temporary irrigation sort of situation. Yeah, when I was working on the landscape stakeholder advisory group, this came up a lot, where we thought, oh, you know what would be a better way to do this is to just say irrigated area. But then we saw a lot of problems with that too. So I guess, if there's new planting, right, it should, right, Teresa? Like, don't you, if there's a new planting, let's say you have, we go back and forth on this. It's really context driven, but I would say generally that's a good rule of thumb, especially for bigger projects. They're not going to not put irrigation in. They're not going to not put irrigation in.
Okay.
But we had a residential project. If you have a residential project, right?
It seems like some folks are doing it just to get out of WELO, and they're planting in it. I would want to know that they're planting low water use plants in there. I would want to know that they're incorporating their compost. So in applicability, there is no exemption for them except for mine land reclamation and habitat restoration. So that would not apply to single family homes. And so, yeah, so it's not as clear cut as it could be in the language of the ordinance, but it also is not explicitly exempt. And So
Great,
I guess
thanks.
there's some discretion, but you know,
Yeah.
I would
And
say
then-
it applies because it's explicitly exempt.
Great. A couple people have asked about landscape areas smaller than 500 feet, and are those exempted from WELO requirements?
Yeah, they're not covered. 500 square feet is the
Yes,
smallest.
they're exempt.
Great.
I mean, they're not even exempt. They're just not covered. The threshold starts at 500 square feet for
Okay,
new
great.
construction.
I think
Unless,
you answered-
wait, let me backtrack a little bit. Your jurisdiction might have done something different, so it's good to check with your local jurisdiction. Some place might say it's everything. We're going to go anytime there's any landscape project. We're going to do it at 100 square feet. So the state model ordinance says 500 square feet.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I think you covered the pool question. It was just that it would be a high water use. There's no irrigation efficiency associated with that.
Right. Right. It needs to be included as a high water user. That's right. Yeah. And it's just any water feature actually. That means it could be anywhere from 0.8 to 1. Great.
We have two questions about no-mow grass considered under WELO, and could it be planted in more than 25% of the landscaped areas? Do they count as lawn or turf?
I might ask Shasta to talk about this one too,
Okay.
because I think he's had more direct experience. But my understanding is that if you can provide with the no-mow stuff, which is great, if you can provide the research, third-party research that it uses less water and that you can get a reliable plant factor from that, then maybe. Shasta,
Okay.
do you want to say anything about that?
Only to agree with your statement.
Ooh, that's the best. Okay.
Great. I think there are some other great questions here, but we will be either responding to them later or perhaps in typed responses from the presenters, or we can respond to some stubborn questions that we couldn't get to after the website as well with the frequently asked question. So yes, you'll be receiving an email after the class. You will be able to download the slides from our website, and we are recording this video, which we will see how good the quality is, and we will share that if we think it's worthy.
All right. How's everybody doing? You're all muted. Okay. All right. Start off.
Some folks are raising their hand. They're feeling good.
Yes. Excellent. I like the response. My name's Shasta Phillips, and I'm going to talk about irrigation plan review. A little bit about my experience. I worked with the Marin Municipal Water District for 15 years, and 10 of those were in water conservation, and a good portion of that I did the plan review for WELO compliance. I was also a water conservation specialist and did over 1,000 site evaluations, water audits, as some call them, and most of those involving irrigation. So full disclosure, I've not reviewed a plan in over 3 years. So I really want to talk more broadly about my experience and just give you some of the best practices I learned in my time reviewing WELO. So a few takeaways I wanted to, that I want you to take away with yourself is that the WELO review process is, it's really all about communication, and that you don't need to be an irrigation expert to do WELO, and that I really encourage everyone to use a checklist. And finally, that it's an important idea to require an irrigation audit, and that can find any issues that may have been missed during the design or during the build. I'm also going to turn off my video so you no longer have to look at the haircut that my spouse gave me.
It looks good, Shasta.
Thank you. I'll pass along the compliment. Okay, so irrigation design plan is really, to me, it was all about communication. So this is the designer saying, I interpret the requirements this way in this particular case, and the reviewer is agreeing or disagreeing and providing feedback so that everybody is on the same page. And in my experience, we worked with a lot of homeowners, and I would get something probably not as bad as what you see on the left, but what I really wanted to see was something more like what's on the right. Something that is specific and detailed and shows that they understand what the requirements are, and that I, as the reviewer, am agreeing. And then on the one on the left might be really colorful and nice, and I like that the hands and feet look like pitchforks. But other than that, it's not going to get us to where we want to be. So this reminds me of an old story that some of you might know or heard when you were kids, perhaps, about a homeowner that leaves for a long vacation. And before she goes, she hires someone to paint her house. And she doesn't really specify color or her requirements, and she goes off and has a great vacation. Well, when she comes back, she's very excited to see how the house looks. And she finds it looks exactly the same. She sees the house painter who's on site, and she's a bit frustrated, and she comes up and says, what's the deal? I hired you to paint my house. He smiles and hands her a painting of her house. I'm going to pause here for laughter. Okay, that's probably all we got. So you see how communication is really important when we're building. I did spend 8 years in construction management at the water district before water conservation, and getting it right and getting communication really benefits the owner, the designer, and the builder, because they're the ones that are going to be responsible for fixing the problem. And that could mean, digging up and cutting into pipe and installing misplaced components. So the onus and the benefit really is on the designer and the owner and the builder. And we can, as a reviewer, help facilitate a good project. Now, in this case, this was okay. The homeowner, she sold this painting at auction. This is an Edward Hopper. So she actually did really well. So it got $1.2 million. But most of the time, it does not end this well. And that's a true story, and you really don't need to fact check it. So I'm going to go over just real briefly, since we'll be talking about some of these components. I just want to give a brief overview on some of them. And I want to find my little pointer. I don't think I have it. That's fine. Okay, it's going to have to be with my mouse, so it's not as clear, but okay. So we're going to start from the water coming in from the street here, and there's a main line in the street and a lateral line feeding this property into a water meter where the volume of water being used can be recorded and charges can be made properly. And then what happens if it's not a dedicated irrigation meter, then it's probably a portion will split and go into the house and feed some kind of interior use. What we're interested in is where it splits from that and starts to feed the irrigation system. And this is what we call the point of connection. And that is typically the next component is a shutoff valve. And this is the master shutoff valve that can shut off the whole irrigation system and isolate it from the other portions of the piping. Then we come into a backflow preventer, and this is aptly named because this prevents backflow of water. So water is pressurized and pushing forward, and what happens if, say, there's a fire down the street and a large volume of water is being used, the pressure might actually reverse and pull water from this system back into the municipal supply, potentially causing a cross-contamination or just bringing in something that we don't want to have. And people have gotten sick from this, and there have been actual deaths from this. So that's why this opens up and spills the water out if it feels that backflow, that reversal pressure. Then we have a pressure regulator, which will reduce pressure as needed. Where did my pointer go? And we move into a master valve. The master valve is a control valve that connects up to our irrigation over here on the right. Our irrigation controller controls these valves, these control valves. And the master valve, there are many controls. You see these 3 downstream. These work in concert with those and only open when those are scheduled to open. And that way, if there's any problem downstream, say one of the downstream controllers are stuck open and leaking, they won't be supplied water because the master valve's not on. So it's a nice water saving device. Coming along the pipe still, I hope you can see a little bit of my mouse. And then we're coming off, here's an isolation valve. These are great to have for troubleshooting, for leak detection, and just for fun. Then we come to the actual control valves. And again, these are controlled by the schedule in our irrigation controller. And this irrigation controller is a smart, quote unquote, irrigation controller, or self-adjusting with real-time data. And you see up at the top, there is a weather station that's connected and communicating. So once this is told to open up by the controller, water is released, pressurized water comes in and feeds, in this case here, this is a drip zone or station, or it might feed a spray station or zone or valve. These are all the same. You'll hear this in irrigation speak quite a bit. Valve station, they all generally refer to the same thing. What's turned on when one valve's turned on. So that is Irrigation Components 101. So understanding how we read irrigation plans, and I found that every irrigation plan has its own language. And many times they're similar, but you really need to learn the language of your specific plan that you're reviewing. So what do these symbols mean? You know, I don't know, could be, looks like kind of a cool train heading into some clouds, and right in the middle of javelin practice or something. They could be Egyptian hieroglyphics. If they are hieroglyphics, then the irrigation legend is your Rosetta Stone. So this is where you start to learn what the symbols mean, and oftentimes you get model numbers as well as a detailed description of what that component is. So when you put the two together, you start to see, oh, this isn't a train, this is a backflow assembly. I see a flow meter, I see a master valve. It's starting to make sense. So now that we kind of get an understanding of the language of the irrigation plan, I wanted to talk a little bit about how actually to complete a plan review for irrigation. And I'm going to highlight and reiterate what Teresa said earlier about a checklist and how important it is. Again, the communication component. The applicant saying, I did this, and a reviewer, you're saying, yes, you did, or no, you didn't. You need to focus on this area. And for me personally, I think there's few simple pleasures in life that are better than checking a box for completion. That is just really, that's why I get up in the morning. And if you're like me, then plan review might be for you. So what irrigation components are required? There's a long list, and you're going to use your checklist. But just know that some are required always, and some are conditionally required based on aspects of the plan that you need to look, be it square footage or resi code or whatever it may be. And once you find it on the plan, boom. So if it's not required on the plan, it's not quite as fun as checking the box, but you can always, you know, put in it. It's mildly fun. Not applicable. All right, so this might be this is a typical irrigation sequencing provided by East Bay Mud. And as a WELO reviewer, do we care about the order? The simple answer is no, we don't. We care that the components are present so that we can check the box. And I do want to mention back before I move on that our job is not to design the best irrigation design since the Roman aqueducts, right? That's the job of the designer. That's their job. Our job is narrowly focused on ensuring that this plan complies with WELO. All right, so now we're going to be able to review an irrigation plan on our own here individually, where there's going to be a poll created. And I want you to take a look and see that now if you need to, you can move the poll, right? Yeah, you can move that poll where you need it to on your screen and just check and see that those components are present on the irrigation plan. We'll give you some time to do that.
If you were multitasking or something, what Shasta's given you here is a chance to find the irrigation components in the irrigation plan and answer the poll as to what you found and what you didn't find. Thanks. You have about, I don't know, 30 seconds more to finish up.
Okay, we're at half, so I'm going to end the polling. Half of the people. Oh, people are. Just got a clump of people.
Oh, nice.
I think it's that post break, you know, it's kind of like the after lunch lull maybe, and people are a little slower, but we're getting a lot of participation. It's great.
Okay, it's slowed down, so I'm going to end the. Oh, now it perks back up every time I try to slow it down. Okay, or end it. Ending it. And
All right, great. So as most of you found, there was the backflow prevention device, and it's it's kind of buried in here, reduced pressure backflow preventer, and you can see that it was located right here on the plans. The remote control valve was on the plans as well. water meter was on the plans, and the master valve was not on the plans. So a bit of a trick one. There was a master valve in the irrigation legend, but it did not make its way onto the plans. And this is a good point to bring up, that I always wanted to see them on the plans, intentionally put in there. Oftentimes you'd find things in the notes or on the irrigation legend, but if it's not on the plans, I don't see that intention to put it to have it installed. So the main line was there as well. Great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we verify compliance and what sections of the plans we look at. And most for irrigation, most of them will be on the irrigation plans. You'll look at the planting plans and the grading plans a little bit. And within each plan, there are tables and notes. There are plan details that we'll want to look at to ensure compliance. And you may also want to look up the equipment itself to ensure compliance. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. So this is what the irrigation plans look like. Several different types: the grading, irrigation, and planting. Most of the time, as I mentioned, you'll be looking at the irrigation plans and just doing that, check the box, find it, it's on the plans. The order, it doesn't matter. We're just making sure that they're adding it. You will sometimes need to dig a little bit deeper. There's irrigation notes, and there are also these tables which might provide information you need. Again, though, I'd rather see it on the plans spelled out. As we talk about communication, I want to see it on the plan, not buried in the irrigation notes. Excuse me. These are plan details. They might look a bit intimidating, but they are not. Each component is identified, and oftentimes you're just going and looking to see that that component is present, and checking a box. So another option you could do is look up equipment. You might want to, if you have a model number, say from the irrigation legend, and you need to know if there's a check valve, well, we can always take that model number, do a quick search, and find that, yes, the check valve is present in the spray body. This is something that I think I developed my own style, and I think you will too, in that how much back and forth you want to have with the designer. I found that it was much easier to have, not to redline everything and send it back, but maybe have a phone call, maybe have, hey, help me find these couple things. I found it to be quite an admin burden to redline and send back, when it might be that I was missing something simple or small, and that a quick phone call could have solved that. But that's something that, or do the research myself to make sure, instead of kicking this back, maybe I just familiarize myself with this model number, so next time I know that it has a check valve. These are all styles that you will probably develop with time. So I want to talk about some of the common errors that I saw, and some are frequent and some are important, and I'm going to focus on the ones that are frequent and important. And let's talk about those. So the most common errors I saw were some problem with the calculator and the inputs that they were doing. And this was fairly frequent and very important, because it must, you must satisfy those requirements. The self-adjusting controller had a lot of errors around it, especially early on in my review career. They've become more standard now. I think more designers know know of them and, you know, how to properly design for them, but still an issue. We did have a lot of missing irrigation components. We'll talk about that. And then the spray irrigation is, there are several spray specific requirements that designers would have problems with. And I'll talk about those briefly. Since Kelly went over the Mao et Wu in great detail and did a wonderful job, I'm going to not discuss that, but we'll start with self-adjusting controllers. So why are these important? I think that the, you know, an irrigation schedule that changes with weather patterns can be really a really powerful water savings tool. Most people adjust their irrigation controllers twice a year, and that's turning them on and off. And some people don't even do that. So what we know is that you can irrigate about 40% less in the spring and the fall compared to the summer. So there really is this irrigation pattern, and that might change from year to year too. You might have, you know, a really wet spring or a very dry spring, and you know, so having a schedule that is adjusting with that weather pattern and what based on site needs is really important. So what were the common problems we would find? That would be, it's simply not a smart controller. It's not self-adjusting. So you would, you know, look up the model number. The other issue is that the weather sensor or the rain sensor were not are not either on the plan or not compatible with the controller itself, or mostly they were just left off. There's also this, you need to have a weather station and a rain sensor, and some do both and some don't. So that was often a common issue, is that it would do one and the other, but not both. So how do you check for that? Again, we can do some research, and you'll see that, you know, if the company is providing a smart controller, it's going to be front and center and not hard to find. And there's only a few. There's not that many controllers on the market, so you will learn these quickly. So missing components, one of the errors we would see would be the missing pressure regulator. And this is probably the biggest one that we'd have, that people would need to dig back in either, you know, cut into the pipe and install a component. Because why is it an issue? Well, you can see when high pressure, it's terrible for water savings. It reduces efficiency and it requires more maintenance. You see this picture on the left. This is what a spray system looks like with high pressure. This water atomizes and simply, you know, floats away from, so you're not putting it on you're giving it into the air, which is generous, but does not help your site. And then over here, you'll see on the right, you'll see a lot of maintenance issues with drip in particular when you have high pressure. And it also apparently makes your picture really blurry. That is a terrible picture. I need to get a new one. Okay, so where do we find the components on the plans? And you did some of this in your exercise, but the pressure regulator is a good example of one you might need to dig for. Sometimes it's right here, clear and center and identified. Other times it's going to be on each valve will have a pressure regulator, and you'll see this in drip because the drip requires greatly reduced pressure. You'll also sometimes find it on a backflow detail. So you might need to hunt around a little bit for it. So spray design requirements, because there's so many that we often see errors and issues with them. So briefly, spray is only allowed on turf and low spreading ground covers. It's not allowed on mulched planted areas, in planted areas less than 10 feet wide. And you'll get to do a measurement tool that you can use to check 10 feet. within 24 inches of areas with non-permeable surfaces, again, using a little measurement tool. And then there's these components that are required. And we would see errors in this simply because of the breadth of the requirements. One that I wanted to highlight is we have been hearing that, especially on city projects and locally here in the East Bay, that we've been having issues with city staff and, or plans requesting spray on mulch planted areas. And I think there's a resistance to get away from spray on a lot of these sites. And what I found when working in Marin is we didn't have this problem as much as it sounds like we are in the East Bay, and that they were able to find solutions that were not spray in most situations. So there's a lot of requirements. It might look daunting, but know that in the plans that we reviewed, I had an old colleague run the numbers. 70% of all plans submitted did not have any overhead spray. So most of the time, you're not going to need to be worrying about these requirements when spray is not present. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the grading plan. It looks a little intimidating, all the lines. And what you're really looking for is checking to see if there are slopes over 25%. And if so, there could be no turf and they must be irrigated with lower volume emission devices. So the good news, again, is that in my experience, I probably had 5 plans total that, and this is Marin, which is pretty hilly, that had over 25% slope and was a planted area. So what's 25% look like? What is that? Well, that's like a street in San Francisco here. One of these streets of San Francisco. Some of you may be too young to remember that show. I'm too young for that show, actually. I didn't see it. So it is a show. I recommend everyone look it up. But what does it mean? It means it's the kind of slope that they have to etch steps into the sidewalk. So this is very, very steep. So most of the time, we're not worried about it. So these are the takeaways. And I'm happy to answer questions probably at the end. And since I'm done.
Great, thank you, Shasta. And yeah, if you have any questions for Shasta, you can go ahead and type those into the question and answer box as well. We're going to turn it back to Kelly, who's going to share her screen to finish up the plan check section.
So now we're going to jump into soil management report and compost and mulch requirements, and then talk a little bit about wrapping up the planning process and how you might be able to streamline compliance before handing it over to Teresa, who's going to talk about post-design requirements. Okay, let's see. So as I mentioned earlier, yes, a soil management report is a required submittal, and it can be submitted after design if it's not possible to get a soil report for the soil that you're actually going to be using for your landscape. So for example, mass grading is the example they give in WELO. It could also be, like I said, urban infill, or you're going to have some imported topsoil or something like that. Whatever the case, the soil management report, it comes with a soil analysis ordered from a soil lab, and includes the recommendations for amendments and that kind of thing. And I just want to point out, because, and I know Rick is on this webinar, that he pointed out that people are submitting a geotech report or a geology report, and it is different from that. It is a soil management report. So don't, make sure that people understand that that's not sufficient, because it's for planting, not for building, and which is kind of more what those reports are for. Okay, so here's what's in it. WELO is really good about telling you what they want in it. So it's a lot of pretty standard things. Soil texture, infiltration rate, They can also do that in the field if they want, but most people will do it in the lab. pH, total soluble salts, and sodium are required, and this is listed in the ordinance. Also required is percent organic matter. And the reason we care about the percent organic matter is, even though, let's say, soil is 50% mineral, 25% air, 25% water, and it's only 5% organic matter, right? And I know that doesn't add up to 100%, you know, so with some variation in there, it's just a little bit is organic matter. But that provides so much of the function of a soil to a soil. So it facilitates nutrient exchange, affects water holding capacity, infiltration rate, drainage. And that's why keeping that at a healthy level is why we want to add compost. Here is, okay, back, sorry, it's hard for me to stop to not talk about compost, even though slide is not about that. Okay, so here is an example of a soil report request that you can get from Waypoint Analytical. Some of you may know this company. It used to be called Soil and Plant Lab, but Waypoint bought it. But there are soil labs up and down the state, and you can find them sometimes through your local UC Cooperative Extension often has a list of soil labs. And what you'll notice here is that you can ask for a WELO compliant soil test. And so if people are having trouble not knowing if you're getting soil tests that are not compliant, point them to a soil lab that does provide one. And Waypoint is nationwide, so they may have soil labs in Southern California for those of you down there that you can use. So the report comes back. Here's the analysis I was mentioning. You'll see here's organic matter over here. And this is two very different. This particular project involves the tearing out of concrete, but also replacing an existing landscape area that had acacia on it. So you can see over here from the acacia area, we had high organic matter content, 6.8. And where the concrete was, it was pretty low, 1.1. So you would obviously have different amendment requirements in each of those places. So the report will also have a recommendation with it, which is usually a narrative like this, and this should be included in the submittal. And so to go back to this slide, where we had the 6.8 organic matter, that's pretty high. So it's obviously going to have a different recommendation. And we'll talk about the different compost requirements and the exceptions on the next slide, or the slide after that. And anyway, but you can see here, there's your recommendation for composted green waste amendment. And I want to be clear that this is not nitrolyzed sawdust. That was a question that came up. And nitrolyzed sawdust is not a soil amendment. It has to be compost. And one of the recommendations that we gave in the Landscape Stakeholder Advisory Group for the next update to the WELO was to use the standard definition for compost to make sure that this is clear and eliminate that confusion. Okay, so if you're gonna, for verification, you are going to need a soil management report. Now, if you don't have it, that's okay. You're still gonna need a planting plan, because there are some default values. There's still things you need to check that you don't need the soil management report to check. And so you'll need the planting plan to figure out, or landscape plan to figure out what is where, right? And a plant and specifications or notes. Oftentimes the information about soil prep is going to be in notes on a simpler project. It might be in specifications on a larger project. And details, you can often find a lot of good information in here. So you can see they've got their compost, amended soil, and organic mulch requirement met through this detail right here. And then you might need, especially on a larger plan, a soil prep plan, which will tell you exactly what's going to happen in the soil, and potentially a layout plan and maybe an irrigation plan too. It's good to have the whole set. So in looking for compost, or in trying to make sure people are meeting the compost requirement, you want to make sure that they've got the right application rate. Now, the default set by DWR is 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, and it's an application rate that matches the lab report recommendations for organic matter. So, for example, if you had really high organic matter, you might need less than 4 cubic yards. per 1,000 square feet. And if you had really low organic matter, potentially the soil report would recommend that you add more compost to your soil. The other thing specified by the WELO is that the compost be incorporated to a depth of 6 inches. And there's an exception, as you can see in this photo. This is it may be kind of hard to make out, but this is a sheet mulching project where it's a lawn renovation. And there's a layer of cardboard here, and then there's a layer of compost that they're putting in right here. And on top of that is a layer of mulch. And they won't be incorporating it, but they will be applying the appropriate amount of compost per 1,000 square feet. And in this situation, it is okay. And then there are some exceptions and limits, right? Thresholds. So if the existing soil organic matter is 6% or greater, you do not need to add any compost. And so looking back at that, if remembering that soil report that I showed you, one of those was 6.8% organic matter existing. So that area would not need compost. But the other part of the site that was 1.1%, that area would need compost. So there you go. One thing, when I asked Julie for clarification about this, was that it wasn't, if you had a situation where your existing soil organic matter was 5.5%, you wouldn't have to add 4 cubic yards of compost, because that would push the organic matter over 6%. So that's where it's important to follow what's in the lab recommendations and look at getting to that 6%. You don't need to go beyond 6%, if that makes sense. And if not, just ask. So here's a little summary. We will be sharing this presentation, so you can refer to this table later. This is just about where you might find, where to look for the different, to verify the different measures in WELO. Oops. So mulch, okay. So for mulch was already in the WELO before the update. It was 2 inches. They upped it to 3 inches. So you're looking for a minimum 3-inch layer of mulch. And another requirement is the mulch be made from organic recycled content material, and I will talk about that. And there are exceptions to mulch. So as I mentioned earlier, turf, that doesn't make any sense, creeping or rooting ground covers, direct seeding applications, but also pollinator habitat. So this has to be noted in the plans, but a project, they can leave about 5%, up to 5%, sorry, of their soil uncovered to act as habitat for ground dwelling native pollinators. And so it's really hard for them to get through 3 inches of mulch. So it's good to leave some space. If you know you have a project like that where you want to foster good habitat development for native pollinators, that is okay. But it can't be the sort of, the reason it has to be in the plans is so you aren't like out there in the field doing a site inspection and you're walking around and you're like, why isn't there any mulch here? And it's like they just ran out, but you know, they're saying it's pollinator habitat. Like that, no, that doesn't count. And then another exception, of course, is fire. If there's a local fire ordinance that has specific requirements about mulch, make sure to let your submitters know about that. So the most common mistakes we see with mulch is, well, no mulch, that's a good one. Not enough mulch, and then that it's kind of the wrong kind of mulch, right? So it's not the organic material, it's not made from post-consumer content. And so I guess the next question, and so we'll, again, I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means. But first, I want to talk about fire a little bit more. Again, you want to check with the local fire ordinances. And a common, sometimes there's a setback where you need to have a gravel band away from a structure. And then of course, you know, not all mulch is the same. So you might have a mulch, even one that meets the requirements of the WELO in that it is made from post-consumer recycled content, that is more or less fire resistant than others. So for example, pallet mulch, which is a really common one, or playground fiber, those are both really dry, and they'll go up, or gorilla hair, they all go up, like that's kindling, right? But there are other types of mulches, such as composted mulch, which is kind of screened overs. I'll show you a picture of it, that when they did this study at the University of Nevada Extension, they found that those were the slowest they smoked, maybe they smoldered a little bit, but they didn't actually go up in flames. The other thing I'd like to say about fire and mulch is that mulch is your friend, because mulch suppresses weeds. So when I talk to CAL FIRE, I have this great opportunity to talk to several people from CAL FIRE and the Diablo Fire Safe Council. And they said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, you probably don't want to know this. You're not going to like this, but I work in compost and mulch. And I know how you guys feel about mulch. And they said, oh no, we love mulch. And I was really surprised to hear that, because I always hear about this conflict between fire and mulch. And their reasoning is it keeps weeds down and it reduces the fuel load. So they do like to see mulch, and they do like to see smart plantings, and there's many other things that you should be doing to avoid fire, of course. So the other question we get is stormwater, right? So what about stormwater? What all this mulch floats, like I'm not allowed to use it. Well, that's not true. At least in the Bay Area, through the Bay Area Stormwater Management Association, we want mulch, and actually we're working right now to do some studies to figure out which are the best mulches for stormwater treatment, in that they are the most float resistant and they migrate the least, because even gravel is going to migrate, right? Like if you have a poorly designed stormwater feature, you are going to get movement from your mulch. And what they've found is, interestingly, it's the mulch that's the most fire resistant, which is the composted mulch, is actually one of the mulches that performs the best in stormwater too. And this is because it holds more, it's more absorbent, it holds more water, it's denser, and it knits together well. Another good option is an arbor mulch that has a fair amount of fines. We're working on a specification for this so that it's easier for people to find and buy and make. But in biotreatment, I think a lot of people, what happens is they specify bark, and bark just is so light, it just goes everywhere. So yeah, bark is not a good idea for stormwater, but there are, if you see someone submitting and they have a low impact development project or some other, and they've got some stormwater treatment there and they don't have mulch, there are options you can tell them, and they are required to have it. Okay, so I've talked a lot about how to tell if it is organic recycled mulch. Here are the acceptable materials. Here's tree trimmings. These are the composted overs, or the composted mulch I was talking about. So when compost is made, it's made from green waste or food waste or a variety of things. There's always a woody component to it. It goes through the composting process, and then it can be done composting, but it's not the stuff that we think of when we think of the compost in the bag yet. To get to the stuff that you find in the bag, what they do is screen it. So they're screening out these bigger particles, this woodier fraction. And this woodier fraction is also, it's been tumbled through the composting process, and it's covered in compost fines. It's also, weeds have been killed, pathogens have been killed. So anyway, it's a really stable product, and because of the compost fines, it's also providing a little bit more organic matter. Anyway. My favorite mulch, if you can't tell, and I have a favorite mulch. So, okay, let's see. Here is another option, pallet mulch, which I mentioned, which is made from shipping pallets. Those are all acceptable. Here's the unacceptable list: bark and gorilla hair, which are both virgin materials, so other virgin materials, gravel, tires, even though they're recycled, they're not organic, and playground fiber. And I want to say, have an asterisk about playground fiber, because you may need playground fiber because you need an ADA compliant surface. And so that is a different story, obviously, that would supersede these requirements. And I want to also say that when you look at the definition of mulch in the ordinance, all these other unacceptable materials are included. They are mulches, because the way that the mulch requirement is written is to give preference to organic recycled mulch when it is locally available. And it is. And so that's the thing. Throughout California, we have a really robust organics recycling program. We have many chip and grind facilities, many composting facilities. So you can find this material. It might be harder to find in some places than others, like just getting the information, but it is there. So if you're in the Bay Area, you can go to lawntogarden.org/marketplace and search for these different mulches. So hopefully you can see that on my screen. So if you were looking for mulch and you wanted it retail and you wanted it delivered, and you were in Oakland or Emeryville or Berkeley, because that zip code covers all of it, here you go. So you can search that way, and then you can find out what the products that they have are and the different vendors. You can also see, so some of these are vendors, some of these are actual producers, but they're here because they will sell you the compost and the mulch. And if you wanted to find, I wonder if you can, let's see, oops. So if you're looking for recycled content, then you can filter it down a little bit more that way. And it would be great if we could have made that for the whole Bay Area, but for the whole state, but it's only for the Bay Area. If you're in other parts of California, you can go to the US Composting Council's website and find a composter there. Typically composters are also making mulch. And another place to look is on CalRecycle's website in the solid waste information system, although I will say it's not the easiest to use interface. So, but there are definitely options out there. So again, here's another reference slide for you to verify the mulch requirements. And then lastly, some tips to get in compliance. Of course, instead of just requiring what the WELO requires, you could also require details and specs and other pieces of information that would have or documentation that would have the information that you need to verify. You can provide them with education by giving them this link to lawntogarden.org if you're in the Bay Area, or if you like, we can send out the US Composting Council and CalRecycle information so you can find vendors and producers throughout California. And then one thing you can do, I sort of touched on, is provide some guidelines for applicants on asking for the right soil analysis. So ask for a WELO soil analysis, or say, how much compost do I need to bring organic matter to 6%? Because this will let you know if you need to go over 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet or below that. You don't need that much. It'll tell you exactly what you do need. So, and then you could provide a model specification for compost and mulch, which would include, just to kind of smooth the path to construction, language that's in the specifications to require that delivery tags and bills of lading be retained by the contractor and submitted for WELO review, so that they're aware when they bid on the project that they're going to have to hang on to this information and ultimately submit it to the city. And the other thing that a good specification can do is ensure quality of product, not just compost, but also mulch. So Teresa mentioned this. I am going to talk about SB 1383. I don't know if any of you have heard of this law, but if you've heard of it, it's probably been in the context that it's going to require 75% of organics to be diverted statewide from landfill statewide by 2025. But one thing you may not be aware of is that there's a piece of this that requires cities to purchase or procure, let me rephrase that, recycled organic materials products. And so 2 of those materials are compost and mulch. And the regulations they're in their final draft form right now. And they will we'll probably have a final by June 30th. But basically it is a lot of compost or mulch, and you can use different combinations to meet your target, but the target is based on the size of your city. And and so if you have a big city, you're gonna have to buy a lot of compost. Now I do want to say that there are other options too, that I'm not going to really talk about because they're not super relevant to WELO, but renewable natural gas from anaerobic digestion and electricity from biomass are also options for your cities to meet these procurement targets. but a lot of times those are not available to cities. So really people are going to be leaning on compost and mulch a lot. And so in addition, okay, so there's that. So the other thing that these regulations do is they require cities to enforce the soil, the compost and mulch requirements in the WELO. So while DWR, people have been being sued because they're not complying with the WELO or not enforcing the WELO, the difference with this regulation, CalRecycle is enforcing on the cities, and they can penalize the cities for not enforcing these compost and mulch requirements. And so what's going to happen starting 2022, they're going to require annual reporting to themselves, to CalRecycle, for each city on the number of projects subject to WELO review. So you would not be doing this directly, most likely. You would be you'd be coordinating with someone in your public works that works on solid waste or recycling, because they do this report every year where they report on a bunch of other stuff. But now they're going to be asked to report on whether or not they've enforced the WELO and how many projects. So that's one way that you're going to have to coordinate across your departments. And just to give you an idea, the penalties are vague. They can be anywhere to $500 to $10,000 a day. This is likely not a $10,000 a day penalty, but that is up to your local, the local assistance staff for CalRecycle. So we don't really know what the penalty would be. Just so you know, there is one. And as I mentioned, right, you have to procure a minimum amount of compost every year. It also comes with a penalty, but they just changed how they calculated it, so I'm not going to talk about that. So the WELO projects, I want to make this clear too. Any WELO compliant project that your city does, like it's a city project and it complies with WELO, all of those projects, the compost and mulch used on those projects, can be applied to meet this hefty procurement target. But any of the WELO compliant projects that you do that are private or not your city cannot be used. So that's where it stands right now. Anyway, so if you have questions about that, please let me know. And that is a statewide thing. And again, the penalty for this part is up to $10,000 a day. Okay, so back to more WELO stuff. The best way, I think, or one of the easiest ways to get compliance from applicants is to educate them and make it easy for them. So here are some things you can do. Provide WELO brochures at the counter. Have a web page. Someone asked if there were any good examples of cities that had this information on their website, and so I replied to the group. I hope you guys all saw that. I mentioned SFPUC, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and they have a great website that helps people navigate. Do I have to comply? And ask them the basics about their question, or about their project, basic questions about their project. And then lastly, and so in addition to these resources, and you have some now that you've downloaded for today, and some other tips we talked about, including your setting your own ETO just to minimize that mistake and not have to go back and forth about that, is promoting training for applicants too. We, Stop Waste and PG&E over the last several years have collaborated on a one-day training on WELO. And this year, Rescape California will be doing this training with PG&E, and we'll make sure to send all of you links so you can promote it to your applicants. And if you want to sit in on it, it's a full day of WELO, so if you want more training, there is that. And then of course, we've talked about this a lot. Hopefully you're kind of familiar with the tools that we've developed, but providing these tools and using these tools can also help compliance, not only by just getting better submittals, but also making it more streamlined process, right, to review. And here's one we didn't talk about. This cover sheet, this is a template for a cover sheet that includes all the WELO requirements so that you can just check them off, like all the things and all the notes that they need to include, so that you're not like, oh, they didn't do this note, should I send it back? Oh, I don't know what to do. You know, and a place for their calculations, and it's got a lot of prompts for them to fill for the applicants to make sure that they include all the right information. And I just want to say this was developed by Bruce Chan and Maura Baldwin as part of the Landscape Stakeholder Advisory Committee, their group. And I just think it's a great thing. And okay, let's say you don't want to do any of that, and you're like, I don't want to do any of this. This sounds like a lot of work. It's work. Rescape California, the Rescape Rated Landscape Program, which is a sustainable landscape voluntary rating system for landscape projects. It used to be called Bay Friendly Rated Landscape. And it's a voluntary program, but it does have some requirements. So it has about 14 different required practices and then some credits, like all the rating systems do, right? That other optional things they can do. But one of those requirements is to comply with your local WELO. And so what that means is this is a third-party reviewed process. So that third-party rater, the Rescape rater, is going to be reviewing any project that is submitting for a rating for WELO. So they're going to look at all this stuff in advance just to make sure they can even be rated landscape. So I remember when LEED was trying to gain traction, some cities jumped on by saying, oh, you know, if you're a LEED project, you can be fast-tracked, you know, in an effort to increase the amount of green building in their city. And that might be another policy thing that a city could consider is, well, I've got a Rescape rated project. Maybe you still look at it, but it might be fast-tracked to get more people involved. And then perhaps you accept the Rescape rating as complying with your local WELO. So anyway, there's more information at the link below. And yeah, and I just covered this. So yeah, there you go. So that is it for me for real this time. That's it.
I have a couple of questions for you, Kelly, actually, before we go to the next section. One question is about the quality of compost. One participant said that mostly what they find is sand or ground up wood fiber and soil passing as compost. Can you, and he says just to be aware of that. Any response?
Oh, well, okay. You have a lot of response for that, as you would imagine.
In about 30 seconds?
I know, but I can still do it. Let's see. What I'm going to show you here, you can still see my screen. So if you go to the U.S. Composting Council, they have a certified compost, and which this means is all of these composters who participate in the Seal of Testing Assurance program, which means that they've just agreed to get their compost all tested for the same things with the same methods, so you have an apples to apples situation. All of those composters are listed here. You can find them. Here's the list for California. It's pretty easy to navigate. And then the other thing is, this is where having a specification really comes in handy, because that's where you can say we need it to be an SDA participant. We want to have it be CDFA registered organic, and we want to make sure it's an OMRI, an Organic Materials Review Institute product, certified product. And by doing that, and you know, to get to that level, the compost has to already be, here's the things that you will get if you require those things. It'll have to be tested every 3 months. It'll have to be from a permitted facility. And it might have to have certain types of feedstock. So if you're looking at CDFA organic or OMRI, it would mean it would not include biosolids or mixed solid waste as feedstock if that's something you're concerned about. So I would say that is the way to do it. And that is really the value of a spec. And then I kind of want to know who these people are calling this stuff compost, because I thought we'd moved past that, the skullduggery, but I guess not.
Thank you. One other question about the soil management report. You know, it feels like this means being an expert on this, and in some parts of the state, it might be hard to find the soil management experts. Any advice on that, or local landscape architects, or what would you say to someone who doesn't feel like they're an expert for that?
Well, I would say that as a plan, if you're reviewing a plan and you're looking at a soil report, it's similar to Shasta's point about, are you looking to see if it's a good irrigation plan? Or are you looking to see that it has all the required elements for the ordinance? And the ordinance makes it pretty easy. So you can check and see, does their soil test include these half a dozen things it's supposed to include? Here's here's how much compost they applied. Does it match what's in the soil report? So it can be a matching game, you know? So where if Shasta was talking about checking the box, and in this case, the other kind of test that I liked was when you'd have A, B, C, D, E over here and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here, and you had to draw the line between them. And so it becomes like one of those things, just making sure that each of these things is represented if you don't have that expertise. Now, if you wanted to build that expertise, that's great. You can do that through trainings. And then if you wanted to have that expertise but didn't have the time to build it, you could also consider, then maybe you can hire a contractor. Some cities have independent contractors. I think there are a few on this webinar today that provide those services for cities. So those are some options for you. And again, the Rescape rated landscape, if you wanted to accept that in place of having to do the review yourself, those raters learn a lot about soil, a lot about compost, and they're very well equipped. They have a lot of expertise in that area.
Thank you. One other question that Teresa did respond to in writing on the Q&A is just about native plants and the relationship between native plants and compost and mulch. And Teresa just said, you know, like any set of plants, some natives like low organic matter and some like it high. And so you can include that in your soil lab request and tell them what kind of plantings. Yeah.
You can. And the other thing I like to take this opportunity to mention is there's sort of a myth that goes around that compost is bad for native plants. And this is started because I think people have thought that compost is like a fertilizer, like an NPK style fertilizer with inorganic nitrogen in it. And it is not. That's not what compost is. And it doesn't perform the same way. It doesn't behave the same way at all. So what I would say is that the research that's out there has only shown that the addition of compost has helped the establishment of native plants. And let's remember, the WELO is not about your ongoing maintenance. It's very likely that if you add compost and you get your organic matter, repair your soil up front, that you won't need to add compost later. Because native plants and the Mediterranean plants that you'll be planting to comply with the WELO don't need a lot of organic matter and they don't need a lot of nutrients. However, they do not want to be planted in subsoil, which is mainly what you get. They want to have drainage, and they do need the nutrient exchange still. They need those, they need that ability, or they need that function in the soil. And what the compost does is it improves water holding capacity in the soil and drainage, which both of those things they will appreciate. And then the mulch is really important because the mulch protects the soil from further compaction, right? And it also reduces the amount of water lost to evaporation. So just most new landscape projects, they'll probably be associated with a building, which means the soil is messed up and it's not even soil anymore. I don't know what it is. It's like subsoil or garbage. I don't know what it is. It's a brick. I mean, soil is not, if you're planting a native plant into its native habitat in native soil, I guess I'd ask why are you doing that? But let's say you had a good reason for doing that. In that situation, you probably wouldn't need to add compost or mulch, but that's a very rare situation.
Great, thank you. We're going to stop there. There are a few questions remaining, and I hope we'll be able to answer those at the very end. They're more general. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Teresa for the post-construction portion of the webinar. And just so everyone knows, after Teresa's slides, there's a quick wrap up and we'll be finished. So we will certainly be done by 1 p.m. unless there are more questions that come in.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for hanging in there with us. So take a deep breath and do a little stretch in your chair. You're almost at the end of the training. So I want to put you in the right mindset. This is post-construction. Months have passed, maybe even a year, since you reviewed the project for WELO compliance and you issued the building permit. But you know that because you have flagged this project, perhaps in your agency's software permit tracking system, and you are expecting this. It's the WELO Certificate of Completion. So I'm going to be talking about that, and I'm going to be talking about, talking about how you can streamline that compliance. And I just turned off my little video so we won't be distracted here. And let's, without further ado, So hopefully this looks very familiar to you at this point. I introduced these items just before we delved into plan check. So think of post-construction as verifying what was promised in the permitting and plan check stage. So there can be as little as 6 submittals and as many as 9. And first check that you have all the required documents. And what's helpful, again, we're hitting this, beating a dead horse, but what's helpful is that you use the Stop Waste Certificate of Completion checklist. And so you'll know if all the attachments are there, or you'll prompt the submitter to submit all the attachments. So on the front page of our checklist, we are asking for project information, and here it is. If they fill this out, you've got it. And let's go on to the next page here. So certificate of installation and certificate of completion. It's a little confusing. There's 2 certificates here. Don't get them confused. The certificate of completion is the entire packet with all these elements. And the one for installation is just the signed statement, and it verifies that the built landscape complies with WELO and meets the approved plan. And if the project team had to make changes from the approved plan, they're going to submit to you record drawings or as-built drawings, and they're going to have the statement say that it still meets WELO, and here are the changes that we had to make. So you can see that for yourself. Also in the certificate of completion, you may see the soil report if it wasn't submitted during the permit process in the landscape documentation package for the reasons that we've already covered. So Kelly covered this topic pretty thoroughly. Again, if it wasn't covered, you're going to want to see the soil lab analysis. But regardless if the soil management report was submitted in permit or now, you should see documents showing that the soil analysis report recommendations were implemented. So you want to see receipts for compost or delivery tags for compost and mulch. So that should be attached at this stage in the certificate of completion. Okay, so the irrigation audit is really a vital tool, and I'm going to take a moment here to talk about that. It helps to ensure that all the WELO irrigation requirements were met, and that is why you should verify that the audit took place. You ask that the audit report is submitted and verify it was conducted by a third-party certified auditor and that repairs recommended in the audit were made. So that, if you're using our checklist, that's included. You can, an irrigation audit is essential quality control. It's similar to like LEED building, where commissioning of the HVAC system and lighting systems are functioning as they were designed to do. So irrigation audits check to see if the system was built to the approved design, if the water runs off the site, if the controller is properly programmed, and if it meets WELO standards, and more. Also in the certificate of completion, I don't think I spelled that correctly, the irrigation scheduling of the controller is required for the maintenance of the landscape, and and so we also need schedules for the maintenance of the landscape and the irrigation assistant. Again, the stop waste checklist helps prompt that you get this information. And programming the irrigation controller is essential. I know of 2 projects right off the top of my head. One was a public park where it had a self-adjusting controller, but it was on a manual override, and for a year, overwatering the lawn, turning the lawn almost into a bog. And so it wasn't caught for almost a year out. In another case, another civic project, because those are the ones I get to see, where the where the bioswale was flooded all the time, and it turned out was because there was really hot weather one day and they overrode the controller for manual and to save the new plantings, and they were flooding the bioswale. And so programming is essential, and irrigation auditor is certified. It will help you make sure that you're getting good submittals. So this is something that's in Alameda County only, but your cities may have done this a while ago. All of our cities in Alameda County, they adopted a construction and demolition diversion requirements and a waste management plan requirements for all building projects. So if you add this requirement to the certificate of completion, it ensures that landscape-only projects also conform. So landscape projects can generate significant tonnage, as this picture shows. So it's important that these diversion rates are applied, 50% for construction and demolition debris and 100% diversion of excavated soil. And it can be, if there is a building associated with it, you can have one report that covers both the indoor and outdoor diversion. And then there's also tracking software that you can recommend to projects. In the Bay Area, Green Halo has been certified for their diversion rates for different facilities that these materials can be brought to. So that's an accepted software tracking that makes it easier, especially for larger projects. Also, for streamlining compliance, I wanted to mention some best practices. So some of our cities, in this case, the city of Fremont, they won't give a certificate of occupancy until they have the certificate of completion. And they do a site visit too. So they won't do their site visit. They won't allow people to move in until they get this WELO completion report. And here they make this clear in their materials that they give out. Also, you can make available the irrigation audit checklist to make sure. What we've done in this checklist that we've made is that all the WELO requirements are in there. So the third-party auditor could be using your checklist. This is not a WELO requirement, but it does help improve quality control. And then somebody did ask this question earlier. You can put this on your WELO webpage, which we recommend every city have. The Irrigation Association, it's statewide, and they have a database of certified irrigation auditors. So project teams can easily find a certified irrigation auditor. There are other associations, local schools certify auditors, community colleges and things like that. But this is one statewide source. Certificate of completion. So some more tips for streamlining the process. If you have permitting software, we recommend that you put a flag that you are waiting for the certificate of completion, and do not conduct the final site visit, as I just mentioned for Fremont, or issue a certificate of occupancy. So this needs to be communicated. Often the WELO expert will review it, but the person who is handling the building permit will not have WELO on their radar. So this is why putting it into the software system, if you have one, or creating some other flag would be really helpful. Field inspections are part of the WELO code, and we have several cities that conduct them. And we have an inspection checklist for you. It's helpful. It allows you to verify that the built project matches the design. If all of a sudden you're seeing a lot more turf than you approved, that's a red flag. It also allows you to see if the mulch applications were made. You can verify that the spray restrictions were met. So those are some easy things you can do, catch in a visual verification. So that's it for the certificate of completion. And now Jennifer is going to do a short wrap up, and we have some time for questions.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. And I do, oops. I have a few other questions as well that we can share. There we go. But yes, I wanted to do our quick wrap up in case anyone has to go, and then we will follow up and finish a few more questions as well. So I just want to review our 4 learning objectives that we had today. One was to understand the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance and how to enforce it. The second was to know how to use the Stop Waste WELO Toolkit to help with that. Third was knowing the annual reporting requirements to the State Department of Water Resources. And fourth was understanding how Rescape rated landscapes could be a tool to help you with your WELO implementation. So my quick question to you is if you feel that we've covered this or you've learned something new relating to these learning objectives, just raise your hand. You know, webinars are a one-way kind of thing. I'm curious to get a little feedback from folks to see if you feel like you've learned something new today from our webinar. Give us a sense of your response. Fantastic. Thank you for raising your hands. And now you all got to practice that as well. Oh, that's great. Thank you for your feedback. I want to review just what is available also from here. We are asking for your evaluation. It's a feedback survey that will come to you at the end of the call, but also perhaps in a follow-up email tomorrow. Our training materials and resources are available to all of you at stopwaste.org/WELO training, and our contact information is also presented on this slide. And with that, I have a few notes from Julie from the Department of Water Resources, and just wanted to share her comments, and she was unable to speak. First, she just said she thanked us at Stop Waste for allowing folks from all over the state to join on our training, and I want to thank all of you for joining. We were thrilled to have such a quick response from her email Monday morning, and clearly there's great interest in this, so I'm glad to have you join. And secondly, Julie wants to emphasize something that Teresa said at the beginning of the webinar, which is that sustainable landscaping, doing it right, is not just about making things look good, but really how critical it is to help with climate change, improving a community's quality of life, including our public health, which right now is so critical, and also property values. And I appreciate that, and that's really what's behind this, I think, for all of us, dedicating our time and effort and to understand WELO and enforce it. Finally, Julie says, if anyone wants to join LSAG, which is the Landscape Sustainability Advisory Group, I believe, and I'll ask Kelly to explain more. You can email Julie directly with join LSAG in the subject line. Kelly, you want to talk about that?
Sure. The LSAG is the Landscape Stakeholder Advisory Group, and DWR, as Teresa mentioned, the ordinance, there was an executive order to require that the ordinance be updated on the same schedule as Cal Green every 3 years. And so if it needed to be, they can punt it if not. So in preparation for the last update, DWR assembled a group of stakeholders throughout the state that represented landscape architects, plan reviewers, meddlers like me, I don't know what else to call myself, educators, and interest stakeholders to work on the ordinance and identify some ways to refinements and edits for the next round. So that is what it was. It was broken up into some subgroups, and it was a really great experience. I thought I learned a lot about the ordinance from my colleagues there, and the kind of challenges that they go through, both on the submitter side and the plan reviewer side. So I recommend it. I think it's a good way to learn and good professional development in general.
I would also add that there weren't very many local governments represented there. It was a lot of landscape professionals and vendors and water agencies, but not too many public city or county. So it would be great to have more representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, Julie wants to echo what Teresa said about having local agency voices participating in LSAG. And so what I'm going to do right now is we have 6 lingering questions in the Q&A that I'd like to answer. They're kind of all over the map here. And I'm going to pose those to our panelists. And if anyone has additional questions you want to add, feel free to put those in as well. It is 12:35, so we have additional time. I know we'll be done before 1 p.m. But in case anyone is leaving, I just want to thank you again for joining the webinar today, and do fill out that evaluation. So
Can I say something about that?
Oh yeah, please.
So sometimes when we've done these evaluations through Zoom to an external link, sometimes they don't pop up unless people actually leave the meeting proactively. And even then, I've had it be sort of hit or miss. So just so you know, you will get a link again in a couple days whenever we do follow up. That's all. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. The first question is really an overview kind of question about how many staff does the city need in order, dedicated to WELO compliance to make it work, of course, depending on the size of the jurisdiction. And are you aware of any surveys conducted that capture kind of what effort or number of staff members are needed for this? I know this would be a city by city question, but I'd love to hear one of the panelists respond.
I'll take a crack. There is no survey or anything. It's just informally, Kelly and I have gone out and talked to our city staff. So in sort of small to medium cities, we see 1 or 2 people doing it. The city of Piedmont's very small. They have 1 landscape architect for their entire city. She does capital improvement projects, and she does WELO review, and she coordinates that with the permit counter staff. And then we see some cities such as Pleasanton, which has a growing suburban community, and they have 2 landscape architect staff as part of their permitting and planning. I think they also work on capital improvement, but they get funneled projects to them. We have another small city like Albany, where they've contracted out, especially for larger projects. They have somebody on there, so all their planning and permitting staff know that it has a landscape. There's a WELO assessment that needs to be made, and then if it triggers that, then they know to use their contractor. And then for like Oakland, which is our largest city in the county, they only have a couple of experts for WELO, so they have to coordinate with a very large planning staff. So usually not a lot, but having the right expertise and having somebody who's comfortable. Kelly, do you have anything to add to that? So it can vary. I think it's helpful if you have staff to have more than 1 person. That's why we do the training, so that more people know and feel comfortable with the ordinance.
Great, thanks. And I will add actually that although Stop Waste won't be offering this training again, we are hoping that Rescape California will be taking some of the materials that we've created and offering WELO trainings going forward to folks, hopefully across the state. Great. Another question, artificial turf. How is that addressed in WELO?
Teresa, you should answer this one.
Well, I'll just start off by saying it's not a living material. So so I think it's just like any kind of hardscape material. So you wouldn't really count it towards your water budget, even though it's not water free. But I guess hardscapes aren't water free either. They get sometimes power cleaned and whatnot. So do you have anything to add to that, Kelly?
Sure. I do. I think the consensus that I heard in the LSAG was that when it is irrigated, yes, include it in the water budget because it's irrigated, but when it's not, don't worry about it. It is often irrigated, especially in hot places because it gets really hot. So yeah,
the surface temperature of artificial turf can burn skin in hot areas. So they use the sprinkler system to cool it down.
But yeah, but it is not addressed specifically.
Correct. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And today we've had 4 or 5 questions about no-mow grass, such as buffalo grass. And I saw Julie responded to one, someone who said they couldn't find it on WooCalls, and she said there's actually a separate tab on WooCalls to look at it.
I'm going to share my screen.
Is grass considered a turf plant species, or is it a ground cover? Is the question here.
Why don't I share my screen?
Great.
I have it up. Okay, I'm just doing it. I can do it. Okay, here we go. So you can all see this page. No, you can't yet. Let me hit share.
No, I can't.
Yay, here we go. Okay, here we go. So if you go to the WCALS page, the search page, if you go over here to this link, looking for turf grass, there is a link and they have added this. And so you can see buffalo grass is included here as at the %ET. So there is a place to check for that. So in this case, it is buffalo grass is considered a good like lower water turf alternative. So yeah, I wouldn't call it a ground cover. I would call it a turf, but it is a moderate using turf. Although if you get to your cool season grasses, which I noticed someone had that in their question, those are high water users. And here is what you would have to use is a 0.8 plant factor if you were using any of like the standard issued turf grasses that we see in the Bay Area. Anyway.
Kelly, while you're there, can you show us how to export from WCALS? Julie's asking.
Yeah, no problem. I remember how to do that. Hold on.
The database page, she says.
Yes, search plants. Oh, like if I make a plant list?
Yes.
Is that what she wants me to do? So I have to make a plant list. But I think I can do it this way, right? And I just want all the low plants in Alameda, California. So I go, okay, here they are. And I go, I do remember how to do this. I export the list, here, this green button. And I'll check all of them. I guess I could go through just with some of them that I wanted. Let's say I didn't want Acacia baeliana because I didn't like it. I could, whatever. So there we go. Export list. Add selections to export. This is exciting. 1,000. I should have probably minimized this to like 5 plants, but oh, that was pretty fast. So then, oh, great. Now it says my internet connection is unstable. But I'm not seeing it. Oh wait, it's maybe because I have Excel open and I have too many monitors.
Maybe it downloaded.
Okay, let's try this again. See,
I saw it.
hold on a minute. It didn't. That's what my problem is. You saw it?
No, I guess I'm just seeing what's on the screen. Yeah, I'm just seeing what's
maybe it's hiding. Let's try it again with like 3 plants, 5 plants.
So what Julie adds
Export list.
is that having this export can really show your plan checker easily that the plan factors are correct, and it'll make an easy reference page.
Right. So here we go. Export to Excel. There we go. This is a lot more what you would expect. There's my WCALS Alameda list. Okay, it made it. I think it was just because it was too many plants. I asked it to do way too much. And then you get this. So there you go.
Yeah, somebody asked earlier that can they accept a WCALS list? I wasn't sure what they were referring to. So this is, yes, if your submitter wants to provide this WCAL list for you, you can accept that. You know, that those are low water using plants. They've already looked it up for you.
Yeah, let's just open that again to see what's actually on it, because you may want even more information than is on this. I think you could include this information, but if you were reviewing it, you might want to also see like a plant count, or you'd want to see it organized in a different way, probably too. But
that's a good point. Yeah, that's
like you'd want to have shrubs, you know. So you could, but this information is great.
Yeah, it's an addition to instead of a substitute for a full plant list.
Yeah.
Like you. I have another question here that's related to the plant factor. So there's a range given for plant factors, and if a plant falls, you know, somewhere in that range, sometimes this person's writing that ETWU being below MAWA really can change according to where you are in that range. What should water utilities do to determine if they will meet the budget or not?
Well, okay, this is what I think. I think if it's close, you might want to see, okay, are they calling everything a 0.1 and then kind of take a spot check at your plant list? But I wouldn't go, I think as a plan reviewer, whether you're at a water agency or at a city or anywhere, you have to be careful to not start designing for the submitter, right? Like, because you might want to ask them questions. If it's like if it's like systemic through all of their submittals, then you might say, oh, they're clearly gaming the system, and they always use the low end of the range to no matter what they're planting. I mean, that's kind of, come on, have some integrity as a professional. But yeah, if it's, you know, if it's here or there and they're maybe making an interpretation that's different than from what you might think based on your experience, and it's just a few things, I think that's okay. But I feel like if they look at, if you see something and all the hydro zones are 0.1, that's a little fishy. So I don't know. That's how I would approach it. And then do spot checking. But
I think it's like what Shasta was saying about the irrigation system. It's not, you're not in charge of designing the best irrigation system. You're there to make sure they've met the minimum requirements. And it is the landscape architect's discretion whether that's a windy site and may need more water, or it's a sheltered site and within that plant factor for that zone, they have some discretion to determine determine it. Yeah, but if you feel like they're, you know, it's a hot location and they've been suspiciously putting it all low, it's, you can make that call, but it's really, as a reviewer, you're just trying to make sure they're following the letter of WELO. And
there's only so much you can do about it. I know a contractor who says, when asked about, well, what do you do if you don't meet your water budget? Rather than substitute out some plants or do something like that, he says, I just change the plant factor.
Yeah.
And so like nothing, I don't think you can do much to prevent that. So
I will say in Marin, our local ordinance covered this by requiring they use the high end always.
Yeah, so you could adopt a higher standard than what's in the model ordinance.
And that provides the clarity too for folks, yeah.
Yeah, so no discretion for the designer.
Okay, I have several more questions. So here, this should be a quick one. If you don't require a certificate of completion, you know, basically, are you not complying with WELO, and are there penalties associated with that?
Correct, you are not complying with WELO if you don't require a certificate of completion, and you can enforce penalties, but WELO DWR isn't going to enforce a penalty on you.
Thanks. And then WELO, as I understand it, does not require a third-party irrigation auditor, just that an irrigation audit is completed. Is that correct?
You can have a local agency do it or hire a third-party certified auditor. You can do it, or you can hire someone to do it, is how I interpret it.
None of our cities in Alameda County do it themselves. They require a third party. So, okay. But the local agency could do it if they were so inclined.
Great, thanks. One more question on Appendix D. We've had several today as well. So this person says they're doing production permits. Most will be in the 500 to 2,500 square foot range. Can the developer use Appendix D, and what should I be reviewing? I think we have a checklist for Appendix D specifically.
Yes, we do. So what was the developer doing? 500 to 2,500? Yeah. So if the developer is doing single family homes, that's fine. If he's doing on development, there may be common areas. So the whole project should be looked at as a unit if it's multiple housing units, like a production home development. But if it's one home at a time, then you're just looking at the landscape area for that one home. And yes, you could do the Appendix D checklist for that. Great,
thank you. But I responded to someone's question today, Teresa, that there are some jurisdictions that don't allow you to use Appendix D. They've just made that their own. They want a full WELO compliance.
Yes, City of Hayward does not allow you to do Appendix D. It's an option. It says optional. So the cities can always adopt whatever standard they want, and they can require a full WELO for all projects, or if you want to allow, the state is giving you that option for slightly less rigorous review for small projects, and that's to help out homeowners and things like that.
Great. So what about if the homeowner does their own design for WELO or the irrigation plans? Do they need to have a design professional?
No, they don't need to have a landscape design professional. they can do simple like bubble maps and hydrozone very simply, but they might on the irrigation it's still possible, but yeah, it's going to be trickier for them on the irrigation system, I think. What do you think, Shasta?
Oh, yeah.
Or Kelly?
Yeah, we had a lot of homeowner-based submittals, and they were actually very difficult. A lot of hand-holding, but you know, it's an agent of the owner. They can designate who they want. Could be themselves.
Great, thanks.
The signature, what I was going to say is that signature piece that we talked about is anybody who is authorized to design a landscape. And in the case of a homeowner, they are allowed by the state to design a landscape. And
But they would
grading.
They would still need to sign it then, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Here's a question about the 1-year maintenance and warranty period that could be required before acceptance of the landscape by an agency. So if that were the case, with the irrigation audit and certificate of completion, would you recommend acceptance at the beginning of that 1 year or at the end, I think, of that 1-year period?
Well, you want the irrigation audit at the beginning. You don't want it to be running for a year without having gone through an irrigation audit.
Okay, great. Good point. Here's a crystal ball question. Will artificial turf be prohibited in any future WELO updates? That's better maybe for Julie to respond to. But they say we see it being used to skirt around the 25% turf area and then later torn out and replaced with actual turf.
Wile E. coyotes. There's all kinds of ways you can skirt around the WELO requirements. That's a good one.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I sort of feel like, wow, if someone's that motivated, okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's a question that I think we responded to earlier, but it's phrased a little differently. If a project has entirely unplanted, non-irrigated, mulched areas of a landscape, should it be excluded from calculations like its artificial turf? So it's just a big, bare mulched area, I guess.
Yeah, so I would say, so I'm thinking of like a really big, like maybe a planting along a road, a Caltrans kind of planting where there's a lot of space between trees. And the consequence of including that area in your water budget calc, in your MAWA, right, is that you're gonna have a really high MAWA because you're gonna have all this landscape area, so your MAWA is gonna go up. But in reality, there's only plants in a few spots, right? Let's say you have some trees, but you've got this super high MAWA, so hey, let's plant weeping willows, like, which is kind of against the spirit of the ordinance, right? So I think the intent is to kind of use efficient irrigation and use lower water using plants and to not try to game it. So I would say not to include it and to do more of like that area that's kind of really being planted and irrigated.
Okay, great.
What do you guys think?
A couple detailed questions. One is about if an agency and a water utility have separate ways of calculating their ETWU and MAWA, how do you reconcile that, basically, if it passes one but not the other?
Oh, like some of them include that area and some of them don't, like the one we just talked about?
Perhaps, yeah.
I think too that if a water agency has a different ETWU than a member agency or a city, it should be, it's either a math error or a plant factor, and all the other things should be the same. So it gets back to the plant factors and what you allow, I think.
This is where we think it's helpful to have that relationship where you have a conversation or you can actually work together to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
And I think we had a question earlier too that may have been responded to separately, but you know, who has to report to DWR? Do the water agencies also have to report, or is it only the cities that are required to report annually?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the cities are on the hook for it, but if they've designated a water agency, like Shasta, you had to do reporting, right? Then
That's correct.
Yeah.
For the ones that we would actually provide it to them for the ones that we partnered with. Yes.
Great.
Oh, and then they submitted it?
Yeah, we didn't have any formal agreement. That's my understanding. Wait, I don't know. It was 4 years ago, guys. Come on.
Yeah, so generally it's the cities and the county who report to DWR and not the water agencies.
That's
Okay.
true.
Do we have a specific exhibit showing how pools or water features are reflected in the MAWA and ETWU calculations? Is that part of the water budget calculator?
Like, I don't,
I don't,
like an exhibit, like an exam?
maybe
Oh.
more explanation perhaps.
Well, I can show you, give me a second, you guys have a minute. We do include them in the water calculator. So I'm going to open it up and share my screen again, if that's okay. Do you mind?
Yeah, no, that's fine. This is our last, there's only one more.
Okay. So here, go over here. Here is the water calculator again. I believe, did I not? I included pools in here, right? Yes, cool. All right, so let's say we have a pool. You can go to here and scroll down, and I'm sorry I didn't cover this earlier, but you've got spray and drip, bubblers, which are also kind of weird and we didn't talk about, and then a water feature or pool. And you can see what we do is we give this we did give it an irrigation efficiency of 1. And let's say it's a 500 square foot pool. And it has a plant factor. And I feel like the plant factor piece here would reflect whether or not you used a cover, maybe. But we don't have any guidelines on that. So it is something.
It would be high. It would be
I know
high.
there's been research done on this. We just haven't included it. But
Okay, that's really helpful. I think that answers another question that came in earlier as well. One more question came in. Are there any plans to change the irrigation efficiency values? So what's already kind of required there in WELO in terms of the irrigation efficiency?
Yeah, 0.81 and 7.5, I believe. Not that I've heard of. Have you heard of it in LSEG?
it cut out for a second, so I missed what the question was.
Is there any plan to change irrigation efficiency values going forward?
I know a lot of people want to do that, and hi, Kristen, but I know a lot of people want to change the irrigation efficiency values, but I don't know, and I'll keep an eye on the chat to see what Julie says. She did mention that there's no plan to update the artificial turf, but so Julie, if you have an answer about the irrigation efficiency values, that would be great. I know that that group did come up with a lot of interesting ideas, and the water budget plan, or the water budget group, came up with a lot of really interesting ideas. But I don't know. Not until a new update, she says. So yeah. It sounds like maybe you can look forward to some new irrigation efficiencies.
Great. That concludes it. Someone said it would be great to be able to re-watch our webinar when they're going through a WELO review or exercise. So that would be fantastic. We hope to be able to share the recording with you. You'll see it posted on our website as well. And I'd just like to say thanks to the 148 of you who have still hung in there. Thanks for joining us today. It was a great response, and use the resources that we've provided. And good luck with all of your WELO implementation and enforcement